Chapter 1. Thank you all for coming to celebrate with us tonight. The old man stood, his pig at his side, with his glass of lemonade raised high. Now, some of you might be wondering just why we keep having these barbecues like this, but I gotta be honest, we're running out of space in the house. The gathered crowd, half of whom were related to Old Man Caudron, chuckled. Yes sir, since my grandsons finally got around to getting themselves hitched, we're going to start seeing yet another generation of cauldrons around these parts, and that makes me happier than I can say. At the reference to more cauldrons, Seth Maestro saw more than one set of fingers twitch toward the air. He hadn't been raised in Caudron Valley, but when he'd arrived here from Texas about 10 years ago, he'd been right shocked to learn about some of the crazy superstitions the folks around these parts harbored. Like the number 15 being unlucky, when any fool knew it was the number 13. Or throwing pepper over your shoulder to ward off bad luck, or searching out black cats to pet, or shoving a pickle up your nose on the fourth full moon of the year, bonus points if you convinced someone to eat it after. But one of the strangest was the way the folk who'd been born and raised in Caudron Valley felt about the cauldrons themselves. They licked their fingers and shoved them into the air to ward off bad luck whenever one of Old Man Caudron's grandsons were mentioned. Those grandsons were two sets of triplets, and Seth had never quite figured out if they thought the men themselves were bad luck, or if it was because they were triplets. Seth's best friend Blake might have worked for the cauldrons, but he'd been raised in the area, and still did the stupid finger-licking thing occasionally. When Seth glared at the man, Blake had the good sense to scowl and shove his hands in the front pockets of his jeans. Sorry, he mumbled. Up by the buffet table, Old Man Caudron was still going on about his coming great-grandkids, and how happy he was with life at that moment. Anyhow, our Sunday evening dinners are getting mighty cramped. Oh, sometimes it's nice to have just family, but thanks to Griselda here, the widower grinned at his elderly housekeeper, who blushed and patted her hair and somehow managed to avoid tripping and falling, which was miraculous. We're going to do more of these bashes, so keep your eating trousers handy. The gathered crowd, everyone who wasn't related to the cauldrons worked for them, burst into cheers and here, as they toasted the man with cans and glasses of Miss Tessa's lemonade. She was married to Bob Caudron, one of the triplets who worked most closely with Seth's boss Jim, and made some mighty fine lemonade. Around him, groups settled into laughing and chatting again. Seth sipped at his lemonade and settled back on his heels, glancing around. It sure was nice to have a chance to just relax, even if he worked with most of these guys regularly. Someone somewhere had plugged in a speaker, and the familiar opening sounds of a country song began. Seth hid his wince behind his cup. Hey, isn't this one of your songs? Blake's question was too loud, and Seth hissed at him. Shut up. You want everyone to hear you? But his best friend just shook his head wryly. I still don't see why you don't want people to know, buddy. If I were you, I'd be shouting it from the rooftops. You're a success. I'm happy here, and don't have any intention of leaving Caudron Valley. Seth's mom lived in town, now that Dad was gone, and he had a good life. If people knew where I lived, they might get, well, funny about things. Blake nodded. He'd been there with Seth when the fan letters started rolling in. There was a reason his website didn't show much of his face, and a reason the few times he performed, he wore a mask. Most people just thought it was a gimmick, masked country singer steal show, as the headlines had said, and it hadn't hurt his online sales, but frankly, he was just happy to be making music. Aaron McGovern. Has anyone seen Aaron McGovern? Both men turned to see Griselda, looking irritated, searching through the crowd. She stopped and pierced them with a glare. You work with him, Seth Maestro, have you seen him? Aaron? Seth shook his head. No ma'am. I mean, I saw him earlier, but not sure where he ran off to. The housekeeper blew out an exasperated breath. Well, when you see him, send him over to the dessert table. There's a red cupcake there with his name on it. Blake stepped forward eagerly. I'll eat it for him, ma'am. Your cupcakes are legendary. She waggled a finger at him. No, siree. Your time will come, mister, and that's a fact. You can come on over and have as many of the blue frosted cupcakes as you want, though. Blake grinned unrepentantly. As many as I want? I have a mighty big sweet tooth, ma'am. No more than 6. Seth watched his friend wink. That's not as many as I want. The old woman flicked her fingers dismissively as she turned away, still looking for her quarry. Then you come help me make them next time, young man. Blake was chuckling as she hurried off, hollering Aaron's name. And maybe Seth would have joined in, but at that moment, he saw something which shut him right up. Who is that? He breathed. On the other side of the yard, a group of women were hugging one another, obviously sharing greetings and catching up. The blonde with the short hair was on the arm of Wyatt Caudron, and he recognized her as Wyatt's new wife. The other two looked like they could be her sisters. Who is what? Blake asked. The blonde? That's Aria Caudron, Wyatt's wife. She's cool. Blake was Wyatt's right-hand man at the racetrack, so it made sense he'd know Artie. But Seth wasn't looking at Artie. No, it was the woman next to her, the one wearing 2 long blonde braids and a cute little green sundress, that Seth couldn't take his gaze from. She was stunning. And then she turned, a smile on her face, and caught him staring at her. She had pale blue eyes, and Seth fell a little bit in love. Seth? Buddy? Not Artie, Seth whispered. The one who looked like a melody come to life. Like an aria, sung by the sweetest soprano, the one he wanted to compose songs for. There was already a tune running through his head. Light, and airy, and cheerful. Just like he knew she would be, in that sweet little sundress and smile. The one who just blushed and turned around, because you're staring at her like some kind of creep. Yeah, Seth managed, his voice coming out all strangled. That one. I dunno. Blake was smiling, Seth could hear it in his voice, even if he couldn't tear his eyes from the vision in front of him, as he called over his boss. Hey, Wyatt. Seth shook his head and lifted his cup to hide his flush. Blake's boss was headed this way, and bringing his cousin Jim. Hey, Wyatt, you gonna bring Artie over here? Blake asked in that drawl of his. His boss looked confused. Why? You need her for some reason? Nah, I just want her to introduce us to her family. Those are her sisters, huh? Jim peered at Blake. Why? You interested in any of them? Well, maybe. Blake grinned. Now that you two went and married the prettiest girls in the county, the rest of us have to scramble to find someone to date. That was a load of bull if Seth had ever heard one. Not the fact that Artie and Joy, Jim's wife, weren't pretty, although not nearly as pretty as the one with the braids, if Seth told the truth, but the fact that Blake had to scramble. If ever there were a man less likely to marry, because he was having too much fun dating around, it was Blake. But he was a charmer, all right, and the other men bought it. Well, I wouldn't say the prettiest, Wyatt hedged. I would. Jim blurted. I still can't believe Joy agreed to be my bride, and I'll step outside with any man who says she's not the most beautiful woman in creation. When Blake's grin grew, Seth nearly groaned out loud. He knew what was coming. We are outside, Jim. Seth's boss glared. Well, we can step further outside. While Wyatt chuckled, Blake held up his hands, palms out. I don't aim to fight you, Jim. But Seth might. When Jim turned an incredulous expression his way, Seth swallowed, his gaze darting to the group of women who were still chatting. He understood his boss's confusion. Seth had to be the most mild-mannered man on the whole ranch, but the way that blonde had him feeling, his blood singing and his heart thumping, he could see himself doing something stupid. And he didn't even know her name. Ooh. Jim hummed and then chuckled. Wyatt, I think this one's your department. Which one? Why? Well, it's your sister-in-law he's eyeing so hard. You know they all look the same to me. First of all, rude. Wyatt sniffed. Second of all, what makes you think I can tell them apart? Blake started chuckling. You'd better not let your wife hear you say that. Women can get finicky about things like you looking at their sisters. Seth rolled his eyes. You ought to know. Blake's expression of innocence was far too exaggerated. Moi? Do something like that? Wyatt shook his head at their banter, but he was still smiling. Which one do you want to know about, Seth? She wasn't looking at him anymore, but Seth could picture her face perfectly in his mind's eye. It was a face which deserved to have masterpieces composed for it. For her. The one in the green dress, he said in a low voice, jerking his chin toward the group. With the braids? Wyatt hummed. That's Artie's next youngest sister. They're really close. She's not married, if it matters. Her name's Aria. Aria. Seth jerked around, spilling his lemonade down the back of his hands. You said her name's Aria? Aria, a song composed for solo voice. Wyatt shrugged. It's short for something. Their mom is classics crazy. His grin grew. It's all Greek to me. Get it? While Blake and Jim groaned, Seth turned back to Aria, in a daze. She was named for a song. She belonged in a song. Somewhere, the angels started to sing. Seth? You all right, buddy? He shook his head, then changed his mind and nodded. As his smile slowly grew, he thrust out his cup to his friend without looking. Here. Are you going to go talk to her? Talk to her? His heart pounded a joyful rhythm. That's the woman I'm going to marry. Is he still looking at me? Honey, her sister Artie drawled, he hasn't stopped looking at you. Aria shivered, but it wasn't from the cold, or rather, the heat of the day. It wasn't from fear or revulsion, either. In that moment she'd turned and met the stranger's eyes, something had passed between them. She could still feel his gaze on her, and wasn't sure how she felt about it. Her younger sister Athena was standing with them. He's really quite handsome. She peered over Aria's shoulder and pursed her lips thoughtfully. Objectively, I mean. He's not my type. This particular sister of hers was eccentric, to say the least, so Aria wasn't even certain what her type of man would be. Probably someone with a long hippie beard and wearing tie-dye, named Echo Rain. She didn't say that though. Instead she hissed, "Stop staring at him." Why, Ariadne? He's still looking at you. What did you say his name was, Artie? Their older sister Artemis was smirking. Curse her. Seth Maestro, she drawled. He works with Jim in the stables. I met him the night I helped Moonbeam deliver her colts. Oh, that's right. Athena sighed. It was a full moon that night, very portentous. Portending what, exactly? Aria snapped. Athena shrugged. Just portending in general. Like maybe portending there'd be bacon and eggs for breakfast the next morning? Artie asked. Their hippie sister didn't seem to notice they were teasing her. I'm sure someone had bacon the next morning, right? Knowing this family, yes. Artie nodded to the giant pig who was following her new grandfather-in-law around, sticking his nose into discarded cups and sniffling happily at cupcake wrappers. But don't tell Herman about it. He's very sensitive about the B word. Aria rolled her eyes, but couldn't help the way she unconsciously rubbed at her palm with her other set of fingers, trying to ease the constant pain in her hands. She was glad for her sister's banter, but could still feel the man's, Seth's, gaze on her. Him looking at her made her feel hot and cold and itchy all at once. In a good way. Sorta. Ooh, I like this song. Artie's head bobbed as another track came on. I think Caroline chose the music, and I'm going to have to compliment her. Who doesn't like country music? I mean, honestly? Athena hummed. I don't. That's because you're weird. Their younger sister nodded. Yes. But then she squinted and cocked her head to one side. Isn't this that new internet sensation? The one with the Greek name? I remember noting his name, because it's as strange as ours. Athena actually hadn't been given a Greek name at birth, but she'd taken one to fit in. But still, she was right. Aria nodded. Kurt Theseus. He's the masked singer who got famous on that reality show but then refused to unmask, remember? He did a bunch of covers of other songs, but he's written some of his own. This was his biggest hit from last year, I think. Artie was still bopping along to the upbeat song about summer love. Makes sense you paid attention to him. Aria shook her head. What do you mean? Ariadne and Theseus were lovers, Athena supplied. Surely you remember Mom's story about them? Oh, yeah. Sorry. I'm not much of a history student. Art had been more her forte. The conversation was interrupted when an older woman stomped by, tugging a young man by the ear. You come with me right this instant, Aaron McGovern. You know I told you I had a special cupcake set aside for you. Why, I might think you're avoiding me or something. The poor man, who was dressed like one of the Cauldron Ranch hands, was bent almost double and waving his arms around. Griselda, I don't even like cupcakes. Shush, everyone likes my cupcakes, understand? Aria watched with raised brows as the odd pair stumbled toward the dessert table where, sure enough, a cupcake with red icing was set a little way apart. She wondered what that was about. But before she could comment on that strange encounter, Athena suddenly asked, Are you all right, Aria? Your aura has been all dingy lately. That's a sign of heartbreak, you know. Whatever happened to that guy you were seeing? Aria swallowed. Henry? I broke up with him a few months ago. Yeah, where have you been, Thena? Artie asked. Remember, she moped around for a while? That jerk was cheating on her. Their younger sister sked. I don't care for cheaters. No one did. The cheating was bad enough, Aria whispered, but the lying was worse. She was a very open and honest person, and the thought of someone lying just repulsed her. The world would be a better place if everyone just shared their honest feelings, instead of hiding them. Artie grinned suddenly. Everything I know about Seth says he's a good guy. Aria jerked and started to turn to see if he was still looking at her, but then managed to stop herself. What does that have to do with anything? She hissed at her older sister. Because, Artie's expression turned triumphant. He's coming this way. Closing her eyes on the sudden bout of lightheadedness she felt, Aria forced herself to breathe deeply. She stretched her fingers out and back, shaking out her hands in the way she did to try to force blood back into them when she'd worked them too long. Athena murmured. Oh, he is handsome, isn't he? When Aria finally worked up the guts to turn around, there he was. That glimpse she'd caught of him earlier really hadn't done him justice, had it? He was gorgeous. His jaw was nice and chiseled and clean-shaven, and his eyes were a lovely chocolatey brown. When he pulled his hat from his head, she saw his hair matched the color, and was just long enough to wave slightly and make her fingers itch to run through it. She wasn't sure if she'd made a sound or greeted him or anything. But he grinned. And oh heavens to Betsy, had she thought him handsome before? He was beautiful when he smiled. Howdy, ma'am, he said, and his voice was like melted chocolate. Swirled with caramel and crunchy nuts and everything good in the world. Gurk, she managed. His grin grew. I'm Seth Maestro, and Wyatt Cauldron told me you're Aria Weston? Aria thought she might have gurked again. His voice was just so darn creamy. The man should be a singer. He could make millions, she was certain. Especially if he smiled that way. Under his hands, the brim of his hat bent over. I came to ask you a question, ma'am. Gurk? Aria, will you marry me? Chapter 2. Thank goodness her mouth figured out how to work in time. What? I said, Aria, will you marry me? He repeated. Incredulous, she glanced at her sisters, as if to ask if they were hearing the same thing she was. They both gave little shrugs. So she turned back to him. No, I will not marry you. Why not? Well, look at that, Artie said brightly, reaching out and grabbing Athena's hand. There's that thing I wanted to show you. Over there. What thing? Athena asked with a frown. But Artie was already tugging. That thing. Over there. By that person, far away from here. Athena finally caught on. Ooh. That thing. How delightful. Bye, Aria. Good luck. As she wriggled her fingers in parting and Artie pulled her away, Aria tried not to feel abandoned. But then she turned back to Seth, who was still looking at her hopefully, and she gave up. She did feel abandoned. And confused. And still, intrigued. "Why won't you marry me, Aria?" Seth asked in that melted chocolate voice, and she felt her resolve slipping. Because, focus. "Because I just met you, that's why," she blurted. "I don't know you." "Ah, I see." He nodded and shoved his hat back on his head. "You have trust issues." "Trust issues?" She propped her hands on her hip and glared. "I don't have trust ISS, well, okay, maybe I do at this particular moment in time." "Because of me?" Was he addled? "Well, yes." She blew out a breath. "And because my last boyfriend cheated on me, and I don't like liars." His expression turned serious. "You're absolutely right. Liars are the lowest type of people, ma'am." "Thank you, yes." She gestured, palm up. "That's what I mean. So yeah, I'm having a little trouble with trust these days." He grinned. "I'm real trustworthy, Miss Aria." "Well, that's nice for you. But you'd say that if you weren't trustworthy, wouldn't you? You'd lie to me." That is a conundrum." "Excellent. Glad he understood. So you see, that's why I can't marry you." That, and because she wasn't a complete twit. Who married a man they'd just met? When he sighed, he sounded genuinely disappointed. Which made her feel just a touch guilty. Then she felt irritated at feeling guilty. Practically the first words out of his mouth to me were a marriage proposal. I shouldn't feel guilty for turning that down. "I understand, ma'am." But, when he pushed his hat back off his forehead and smiled, she saw he wasn't one to give up so easily. And why did that thought make her feel pleased? "But," she whispered. "Well, it's kinda my job to work with skittish horses, Miss Aria. I've tamed my share of skittish fillies before, and I reckon I can show you a thing or three." "Did you just compare me to a horse?" "A filly, ma'am. High-spirited and beautiful. Who needs to be tamed?" She narrowed her eyes. "Oh, no ma'am, I would sooner cut off my arm than try to change one thing about you." Well, that was well said, wasn't it? She'd dated Henry for a full year, and he kept trying to get her to settle down in a real job. Did Seth know that? Is that why he was telling her what she needed to hear? So she frowned. "Stop calling me ma'am. It makes me feel ancient. I'm only 27. You can't be that much younger than me." "I'm a year older." He grinned again, and Lord have mercy, that was a nice look on him. "But Mama raised me with manners, so until you tell me I can use your name." "Oh, just call me Aria, for heaven's sake." "Everyone else does," she grumbled. A look kind of like reverence came to his eyes then, and he breathed, "Aria. Will you marry me?" Was it weird that a part of her, a part which was beating along with her pulse, was slapping her in the forehead and moaning, "You should have said yes? I just met the man. Can I have your number, Aria?" She struggled back onto her high horse. "Why?" "Because if you won't marry me yet, that means I've got to convince you to marry me. And that means I need to call you or text you. I just met you. You could turn out to be a serial liar and cheat." "I'm not." She blew out an exasperated breath. "Yeah, but you'd say that, wouldn't you? Then I'd be stuck with a jerk, another jerk, knowing my number, and I'd have to change it again." Seth frowned thoughtfully as he nodded. "You're right. How about we just meet up somewhere? That way you can hang out with me for a bit, to make sure I'm not a jerk, before you give me your number?" That was a good solution. "When? How about next Saturday?" "I'd say sooner, but I want to give you the chance to really learn to appreciate me, more than just dinner, I mean, and Saturday's my next day off." "Okay, I can do Saturday." There weren't any craft shows scheduled for a few weeks, anyhow. "Where?" "I can come to Black Aces to pick you up, if you'd like. Say, 10 in the morning? Wear some walking shoes." She rattled off a location in the heart of her downtown, Wouldn't want some jerk to know where she lived any more than knowing her number, if that's what Seth turned out to be, and he jotted it in his phone. When he looked up, he flashed her that devastating smile again. Gotcha. 10 in the morning, next Saturday. It's a date. And as he touched the brim of his hat politely and wheeled around to hurry off, Aria realized what had just happened. She wasn't going to marry him, no. But Seth had somehow talked her into a date. And how come she didn't hate the thought of that? To Seth's surprise, he was nervous when he arrived to pick up Aria. Not about the date, necessarily, but not about her either. So why was he nervous? He knew she was the woman for him. He'd just taken one look at her, and it was like the heavens themselves had opened up and little bands of angels started singing about her. It was more. Well, he had to convince her that he was the man for her. And he only had this one shot. He swallowed, and took a deep breath, his hands clenched around the steering wheel. When the knock came at his passenger window, he jerked in surprise. But it was just Aria, peering into the truck. When she saw him looking her way, she opened the door. And Lord help him, but it was like his whole heart began to sing. "Are you ready?" she asked, peering suspiciously around the cab of his truck. He forced himself to smile easily. "Sure. You wearing your walking shoes?" "I'm wearing my walking sandals, so that'd better work. I don't wear shoes in the summer, my toesies need their air." She climbed into the pickup, and he couldn't help admire the way her legs looked in those jean shorts. Her hair was in braids again today, but it was tucked under a baseball cap advertising a brewery up in Missoula, and she wore a bright blue t-shirt that accentuated all the right bits. When she turned and caught him admiring those bits, he found himself flushing. But when she lifted a brow in challenge, he shrugged in apology. "Listen, mister, I want you to know I have my sister on speed dial. Everyone in this town knows I'm with you right now." She waggled her phone at him. Good? You bet it's good." Reaching over her shoulder, she pulled the seatbelt across her chest. "So if you're dragging me out into the mountains to murder me and bury the body, think again. The cops'll be on to you like peanut butter on bananas." He peered at her. "You don't have a real good opinion of me, do you?" Was it his imagination, or did a ghost of a smile flick across her lips? "Just drive, Romeo." So he did. His nervousness faded as he pulled out a black aces, and he found himself tapping out a rhythm on the steering wheel with his index fingers. It had been running through his mind all week, along with a series of high, soft notes that reminded him of Aria. They were halfway to the state park, because he was taking her up into the mountains, but not for all those terrible things she'd obviously imagined, before he asked, "So, peanut butter on bananas?" "Yeah?" She shot him a little frown. "What about it?" "Nothing." He shrugged. "It's just an odd combination, isn't it?" "Absolutely not. Have you had it before? Especially with a little honey?" He thought about it, and as he turned into the park, finally hummed. "I guess I've had that combination as a sandwich. And let perfectly good peanut butter be adulterated by bread, when everyone knows it's better on a spoon. Weird." He was grinning as he pulled into a parking spot. "You know what this calls for?" "What?" "Taste testing. I didn't bring peanut butter today, but now I demand a taste-off. I'll make a peanut butter, banana, and honey sandwich, and you bring some peanut butter on a spoon, and we'll decide which is the better combination, once and for all." "You're on." He could tell by her grin that she knew this was a silly topic too, but was into it. "You'll be sorry." "Oh, I doubt that." Because she'd basically just agreed to another date. Reaching behind her seat, he pulled out a backpack. "You ready? Are those your murdering and burying tools? You didn't think I was going to drag you into the woods without them, did you?" She was smiling, he was certain, but she just snorted derisively and climbed out of the car. He shrugged into the pack and met her at the hood. "Okay, have you been geocaching before?" Her eyes lit up, and his breath caught. Lord help him, but she was even prettier when she was excited about something. "Jax, my oldest brother, took me and a few of my sisters years ago. I loved it, it's like treasure hunting." That was exactly the way he thought of it too, so he grinned. Awesome. You get to be in charge of the compass, and I'll carry the caches. He patted his pack. And when we're ready for lunch, I've got sandwiches and water. She was the one who started for the trail first, peering down at the GPS. What are our first coordinates? Jogging to catch up, he read her a list of coordinates from a webpage printout he'd jammed into his pocket, and she typed them in. This way. It was fun. The first set of coordinates took them to a hollow stump not far off the main trail, and the cache was filled with little plastic doodads and toys from fast food kids' meals. It was obviously one of the most popular options for families trying out geocaching in the park, so Seth and Aria didn't touch anything. Want to try something harder? Her eyes gleamed with excitement. Lay it on me, cowboy. The second cache was harder, and they eventually stumbled across it, literally, when Seth took a tumble over a downed log. There was an old plastic container shoved beneath it, with only a few pencils and coins, and simple things a geocacher might have in his or her pocket. "Want to switch something out?" he asked Aria. "Isn't that the point? I remember we're supposed to take something and leave something else." So he pulled out a keychain from a tourist shop in town, which was in the shape of a witch's cauldron. "I had this laying around the house." "Perfect." She snatched up a pen labeled Caudron Valley Veterinary Care and pushed it into her pocket. "Can I leave something too?" "You can, or you can wait till the next cache." He dropped the keychain into the container. "Ready?" "Yeah, but you be in charge of this for this round." She handed him the GPS, and when she did, their fingers brushed. Seth wondered if she felt the electric shock, which seemed to travel up his arm and jumpstart his heart. Thumpa 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 thumpa. You make my heart beat faster, baby. You make me feel on fire. Thumpa thumpa thumpa. This tune was more old-school country, and Seth's fingers itched to be holding his guitar. Instead, he smiled and tried to hold on to the tune, so he could write it down later. For now, just being with her was enough of a song. The third cache was almost impossible. They were ready to give up. It was well past lunch, when Aria shouted, "Wait a minute. Seth, come here." She was holding out the paper, laughing, as he jogged to her side. "Look." When she pointed at the paper, he used that as an excuse to lean over her shoulder, to inhale her scent. "Look, that's not a dot. That's a smudge." She flicked away the piece of dirt, and he had to join her in laughter. "Oh my gosh, I'm so sorry. I've had us looking all in the wrong direction." He grabbed her hand, and maybe she felt that same spark, because she abruptly bit down on whatever she'd been about to say. "I'm having a lot of fun, Aria, and I don't mind if it takes longer." Instead of pulling her hand from his, she squeezed it slightly. "Well, then, let's go find this cache and stop for lunch." They found the little plastic baggie in a hole in a tree beside a stream, and it was her turn to drop in the veterinary pen and her card, after taking out a broken set of earbuds. Seth glanced at the card. Aria Weston, Fine Wool Products. As they settled down for their picnic, turned out they both preferred ham and cheese to bologna. He asked her about it. She was much more at ease with him now, which made him smile as she rested her back against a boulder and dabbled her toes in the water. "I've always loved art. When I was a little girl, my grandma taught me how to knit, which was cool. I loved that you could take a sheep and end up with a blanket. And it could be any color or pattern or anything. It was all up to me and my imagination." "Do you do the actual shearing and dyeing and everything?" She shrugged as she took a bite. "Shantam," she swallowed. "Sometimes. Particularly if I'm being careful about the organic nature of the product, or whatever. I make all sorts of things. Silly hats and cute slippers are always popular, and I do a lot of delicate artsy things, almost tatting." When he looked confused, she smiled. "Tatting is lace making. I do it with yarns, and if I soak it in special solutions, it becomes solid. I even set some in resin for acrylic work." When he whistled, impressed, he noted that she was rubbing one set of knuckles with the other fingers. It wasn't the first time he'd caught her rubbing her fingers, and he wondered if it was a nervous gesture. I've done some work with resin, he said. My dad was a woodworker, and my favorite things to turn on the lathe were the resin pieces, because the scraps were so colorful. She was nodding along. I love the way that looks. I don't have a lathe, I live in an apartment, but I've used my brother's before. I don't have one either. He shrugged and glanced down at the remainder of his sandwich. We sold it, and a lot of Dad's woodworking tools, when he died. Her fingers were suddenly resting on his forearm. I'm sorry, she whispered. That must have been hard. What happened? Every part of him itched to close his hand around hers, to pull her closer, to kiss her. But now wasn't the time. So instead, he offered a little smile. A heart attack took him a few years back. It was real sudden, which was hard for me and Mom, but better for him. They were down in Texas, where I grew up, but I brought Mom up here to live nearby. She had adapted surprisingly well to the cold. She's got an apartment in town, and I live on the ranch, but I was thinking in a few years I might have to bring her to live in my house with me. Of course, now he was thinking about having Aria in that house, so maybe he should hold off on making decisions. In the last week, he'd written her a half-dozen refrains, imagined her in 1,000 happy scenarios. It was weird and hard to believe, this way he'd known her the moment they'd met. If she'd felt the same way, they might have even been married by now. But she hadn't. She was skittish, yeah, but he understood her lack of trust. She'd been hurt before and didn't want to be hurt again, so he had to take it slow. It was the only way. I hope your mom, and you, are happy now? The fact that she cared was a good sign, so Seth grinned. She's a firecracker all right. I think you'd like her. She'd love to see some of your art, I know. Sounds like I would. When I meet her, I'd be happy to bring her a little gift. When I meet her, sounds like Aria was thinking about the future too. He couldn't help himself. Reaching over, he touched the back of her hand. That would be real nice, Aria. I'd like to see some of your stuff, as well. She flushed, but didn't pull her hand out from under his. I'll make you a pair of Bigfoot slippers. They're popular. Okay, but you'd better make them really big. My feet are already big to begin with. She was grinning as he pulled her to her feet. And you know what they say about men with big feet? She winked. Solemnly nodding, he lowered his voice as if imparting a secret. It's true. It's true, she breathed reverently. He held up his hands, palms facing one another, about a foot apart. Her eyes widened. We have huge, he paused. Shoes. She burst into laughter before popping the last of her sandwich into her mouth. Come on, Bigfoot, or big whatever. Let's go geocaching. Chapter 3. The ride back to Black Aces was way more fun than the ride to the park, now that Aria knew she wasn't going to be chopped up by a serial killer or suckered into falling in love with a guy who would then cheat on her. Which was worse? She pushed memories of Henry from her mind and relaxed against the headrest of Seth's passenger seat, chuckling at a joke he'd just made. So, what did you think of geocaching? He asked, glancing her way. With an easy smile, Aria absent-mindedly rotated her wrists, trying to ease the constant ache. I think being honest with myself is just as important as being honest with others, so I have to admit that this was the best first date I've ever been on. His attention was still on the road ahead, but a huge smile bloomed across his face. What? She asked. This was the best first date I've ever been on, too. I'm just glad you called it a first date, and not a never want to see you again date. She had called it that, hadn't she? Her smile slowly grew. And, his delicious voice grew soft. If I have my druthers, it'll be the last first date I ever go on. Oh, that was rather romantic, wasn't it? Will you marry me? For a moment, she allowed herself to think about what it would be like to marry this man, to have children, to tell her grandchildren about their first date, where she'd been a little nervous about him, but had learned he was a good man who made her laugh and whose touch made her tingle in all the best places. Aria swallowed, not sure if she should allow herself to think that way. She'd only just met the man, after all. So all she said was, "You're quite the poet, aren't you?" His smile dropped. Suddenly, he looked awkward, uncomfortable. "Yeah," he managed. "I guess so." For the first time, she got the impression he wasn't telling her everything. As they turned off the main road to a scenic, winding backroad, was he taking the long way home? So they could spend more time together. She shifted in her seat and studied him. "Seth? You know how important being honest is to me, right?" "Oh, yeah, totally." He flashed her another beautiful grin, but did it seem hollow? "And I agree. Honesty is really important in a relationship." "Is that what we have?" she asked softly. "A relationship?" He swallowed, his attention on the turn ahead. "I'd like that. I'd like to take you out again, Aria. Being with you," he shook his head slightly. "Being with you makes my heart sing. Being with you makes my heart sing. Oh. Oh my." There he went, being all poetical and romantic. She was struck with the thought that it would be very easy to fall in love with Seth Maestro. "Oh, shoot, look at that." Seth slammed on the brakes, as her gaze darted about furiously, trying to see what had caused him to react. They were rounding a curve in the road, which skirted a rocky hill. She didn't see any deer or animals which would have caused such a reaction. And the only signs of human encroachment on this paradise was one of those white wooden crosses on the side of the road, which was lying at an angle. To her surprise, Seth pulled over on the side of the road past the cross, tucking the truck up against the rocky hillside on the passenger side, far out of the non-existent traffic on this backcountry road. He opened the truck door, flashed her a tight, quick smile, and said, "I'll be right back," as he climbed out. Twisting in her seat, she watched him jog back toward the cross. Well, now she was curious as all get out. With the rock so near to her door, she knew she wouldn't be able to open it, so she slid across the seat to the driver's side and swung down from there. As she walked, slowly, curiously, back toward the cross, she watched Seth lift it upright. It was large, 3 feet tall at least, and had faded silk flowers stuck into the ground around it. He was muttering to himself as he wrestled it back into the ground. When he got it situated, he patted the top of the cross, then pulled off his hat and swiped at his forehead. She reached his side and read the words someone had stenciled on the cross. Amanda Smith, 1991 to 2012. Aria frowned. "So young. Did you know her?" she asked in a quiet voice, assuming that's why Seth had stopped to fix the cross. But he looked startled at the suggestion. "No. But this is a treacherous turn, and I guess someone took it a little too hard since the last time I came this way," and swiped at her marker. He sighed and patted the top of the cross again, then took her hand. "I guess we're just lucky there's not another one of these out here. Come on." Aria was eyeing him as he tugged her back toward the truck. Before they reached it, she pulled her hand from his and he stopped. "So you just knew her marker well enough to recognize when it wasn't the way it was supposed to be, and cared enough to fix it?" Looking hesitant, he shrugged and shoved his hands in his pockets, not meeting her eyes. "Someone has to." He was poetic and sweet and made her laugh and cared enough about the little things like noticing memorial markers on the side of the road, "and he asked you to marry him." He seemed almost too good to be true. What was the catch? There had to be a catch. No one could be as sweet and fun and kind and full of southern charm as Seth and be real. Right? Unconsciously, one thumb pressed into the palm of the other hand, massaging the sore muscles. "Why do you do that?" His question jerked her out of her thoughts. "What?" He was watching her. "Why do you rub your hands like that?" "At first, I thought it was a nervous habit or something, but now." She frowned down at her hands. "I hadn't realized I did it enough to notice. So why do you do it?" "Because they hurt." He moved with a swiftness which surprised her, likely born from years of wrangling and training horses. One moment, he was standing there with his hands in his pocket. The next, those same hands were around her waist, and he was lifting her. She didn't have time to squeal before her rear end touched down on the lowered tailgate of the truck, and he was reaching for her hands. What are you doing? He settled between her knees, his attention on her palms, and she tried not to think how intimate a position this was, with her legs bracketing his waist this way. If he moved forward just slightly, if she shifted toward him, she'd be pressed against his hard chest, his firm stomach, and, lower. She swallowed, already aching with need, and tried to concentrate on what he was doing. Unfortunately, what he was doing wasn't helping her tamp down on her unruly libido. He pressed the balls of his large thumbs into each of her palms, and she gasped, partly at the sensation of his skin against hers, partly at the way her muscles seemed to melt under his touch. "Why do they hurt, baby?" he murmured, as he dropped her left hand and switched all of his attention to her right. When he began using both of his thumbs to rub at her palm, then moved down to the base of her palm and her wrist, she actually moaned out loud and closed her eyes. She'd been meaning to get a professional hand massage recently, but for some reason, all the nail salons had been closed. This was even better. "Aria?" he asked in that creamy voice of his. Lord have mercy, she didn't think she'd ever heard anything so delicious as the way he said her name. "Aria, sweetheart, why do your hands hurt?" He'd moved his massage up to her fingers and was working on each digit. "Knitting," she sighed. "Your hands hurt because of your knitting?" She opened her eyes and forced herself to focus on his question. "Yeah. It's kind of like carpal tunnel. Or it's a version of it, I forget. Repetitive motions, and all that. Ooh, yes, that's the spot." She saw him grin as he focused on the base of her thumb. "So you just knit too much? Can you take a break and let your hands heal?" She sighed. "That's what the doctor said when I visited. But I can't." "You can't take a break?" He switched to her other hand. Shaking her head, she frowned down at her hand, cupped in his. "I can't afford to," she admitted. "I worked really hard to build my business up to the point where I can support myself. Do you know how hard it is to support yourself knitting? But I have a lot of commissions right now, which is awesome, and I do really well at craft fairs and stuff, when they happen. That means I have to have a lot of inventory, on top of the stuff people pay me to make for them." He hummed thoughtfully. Trying to defend her choices, she hurried on. "I lived with my parents for years, Seth. It took me a long time to be able to make enough to afford rent and groceries and supplies and everything else. I can't afford to cut back on my production, even if it hurts, because then I'll—" She bit down on her words. His fingers stilled, but he didn't drop her hand. Instead, he raised his gaze to hers, his brown eyes serious. "Because you'll what?" "Because I'll fail," she whispered. "If I cut back on my knitting, I'll lose commissions and inventory, and I'll fail. I worked so hard to build my business into a success, and I don't want to let that fail, and go back to working at the grocery store. I want to be my own boss." He held her gaze, and she could see the caring in his eyes. "Do you like it? Knitting? Are you passionate about it?" She winced. I used to be. I loved knitting. I guess I still do." "Do you?" With a sigh, she quietly admitted the truth. "I loved making my own designs. Creating what was in my heart. Now that I'm supporting myself, I have to make what other people want me to make, or what I think will sell. That's—" When she trailed off, he slowly nodded. "Boring? Sounds like it's become a job, instead of something you do for fun." "Yeah," she sighed. His thumbs pressed into her palm again as he lifted her hand, and then he brushed the tip of her index finger against his lips, and she was glad she was already sitting down, because the feel of his lips on her skin was enough to make her knees go weak. "Aria, I wish I could take your pain away," he murmured as he moved her middle finger to his lips. She thought she might have said something, but it probably came out as gurk again, with all her attention focused on his lips. He held her gaze. "I wish I could take care of you. If I could do that, you could knit, could create, because you want to, not because you had to. Create." He understood her love of design, of art. But she swallowed. "I don't want to be a kept woman. I'd never ask you to." His lips brushed against the tip of her ring finger. I understand all about the need to create, trust me. And I admire the fact you've made a living out of it. How could he understand that? He was just a cowboy. No, just about it, girlie. He's a hottie. And darn good at what he does. She had to admit her subconscious was right. Still, he wasn't exactly an artist, was he? And then his lips brushed against her pinky finger, and it shot a bolt of desire straight up her arm, and she forgot whatever it was she'd been thinking. Aria, I like you a lot. Gerbil? He grinned. And I'd really like to kiss you now. Is that okay? This at least, she could answer honestly. With real, actual words. Yes, please, she whispered, her eyes on his lips. And then her eyes were closed, and his lips were on hers, and he dropped her hands to hold on to her waist. Moaning against his lips, she lifted her arms around his neck, knocking his hat off in the process. He didn't seem to care, but deepened the kiss with a little groan, his lips nipping at hers. When his tongue swept along the seam of her lips, she gladly invited him in. He pulled her against him, and instinctively her legs wrapped around his torso, pulling him even closer. There was a warmth, a need, growing inside of her, and she shifted against him, trying to ease it. He groaned again, and abruptly pulled away. They were both breathing hard as he rested his forehead against hers, and she wondered if his heart was pounding as hard as hers was. It was weird to think they were waiting there on the side of the road where anyone could see them, although she had yet to see another car, and she'd just experienced the most incredible kiss of her life. Best first kiss ever, he whispered, his breath teasing her cheek. And she smiled. Because after that kiss, yeah. Hell yeah, there'd be more than just the one. There'd better be. Which meant more dates. More chances to be charmed by his slow southern drawl and his manners and his sweetness and his kind heart. And his smile and that to die for voice. More chances to fall in love with him, she was certain. He'd made it really clear that's what he wanted, even though they'd just met. Could she do it? Could she fall in love with him? Or was she already halfway there? Best first kiss? With a sigh, she laid her head against his shoulder, unwilling to let him go for the moment. It might be her last first kiss. Chapter 4. No, you somehow managed to add another stitch. Laughing, Aria leaned over his shoulder and pointed to the mess of yarn on his lap. Look. See how it gets wider here? Seth held up the project and winced when he saw that she was right. He'd, yet again, slipped in too many stitches. How did he do that? Can't I just leave it? My hat can just be fatter on one side than the other, right? Still giggling, she leaned against his side, man, that felt good, and reached for the trailing end of his yarn. You could do that, I suppose, if you want to look like a complete nincompoop. He liked when she used those funny little phrases, so he grinned at her and nudged her shoulder. Maybe I am a complete nincompoop. In response, she stretched up and brushed a quick kiss against his lips. Too quick. Then maybe I like nincompoops. When she smiled, he knew she was teasing him, but it felt really good. Being around her these last few weeks had made him smile, yeah, but it was more than that. Aria Weston made his pulse pound and his jeans too tight. He liked her, liked the way she smiled, liked the way she could laugh at herself. Liked how open and honest she was about everything, including her feelings. Liked her determination and her drive. She was pretty, yeah, but he'd come to realize he'd like her even if she had a bag over her head. Like her? Hell, he was in love with the woman. He should have realized that as soon as he heard her name. Aria Maestro had a real ring to it, didn't it? He wondered if she'd considered the same thing. He hadn't brought up marriage again, because he'd freaked her out so much the first time, but with both of them having such musical names, it only made sense. Of course, Ariadne Theseus made them sound as if they should be together, too. Wincing, he focused on the attempt at knitting he currently held. It had been a lot of fun to learn from her, and he especially liked when she wrapped her hands around his and showed him how to move the needles. Sometimes he fumbled on purpose, just so she'd hold his hand again. She'd been clear she didn't like secrets, and here he was, keeping a big one from her. This was her third visit to the little house he owned on Caudron Land, and he still hadn't given her a complete tour. There was his bedroom, of course, and the spare he'd furnished with the intention of bringing Mom to live with him one day soon. And then there was the third bedroom. The one he'd lined as a sound booth, where he did all of his recording. His secret. You remember how to frog? Her question jerked him from his thoughts, and he blinked, trying to make sense of it. Frog, oh, you mean, pulling out my stitches? She grinned and tugged at the yarn. Yeah, you have to rip it, rip it, rip it, she called in a sing-song voice, making it sound like ribbit. He fumbled with the needles and dropped the entire project. When he blew out an exasperated breath, she hummed and leaned over to pick it up. Here, I'll do it, she said softly, and her long fingers flew as she pulled apart his last 2 rows. It looks easy, and it is, but if you want perfection, you have to really work at it. And he wanted perfection. I figure if I can get this right, I can help you. Her head jerked up and her gaze slammed into his. What? He shrugged. If I can learn how to do the simple stuff, like hats, maybe you could let me help you out with some of your inventory. So you'd have less to do. Her mouth opened and closed a few times, eyes wide. Finally, she lowered the half-completed hat to her lap and shook her head slightly, as if to clear it. Seth Maestro, I think that's the kindest, sweetest thing anyone has ever offered me. Embarrassed, he shrugged. I'm a nice guy. No, well, yes, I mean, you are. But it's not just the nicest thing a guy has done for me. It's the nicest thing anyone has done for me. He'd do a lot more for her, if given the chance. He shifted so he faced her on the couch. Reaching out, he took her hands in his, rubbing his thumbs across her palms. I told you I wanted to help, sweetheart, he whispered, and liked the way she shivered. He knew what that reaction from her meant, and it was confirmed when her eyelids lowered halfway to cover desire-clouded eyes. I want to make you feel good. I want to do everything I can to make your life a good one, Aria. Marry me. He didn't say it. He wondered if he'd have to. This time, she was the one who tugged him forward, who pulled his lips down to hers. And as always, she tasted like perfection. The feel of her lips under his made him go all hard and soft in all the right places, made his pulse sing and his brain numb. He dragged his palm up her side, cupping her curves, and she moaned against his mouth. They were meant to be together. Too few heartbeats later, she was the one to pull away, and they rested, trying to get their breaths back. How had she ended up on his lap? And when had the top 3 buttons of his shirt come undone? And where the heck had the knitting gone? When he was kissing her, nothing else seemed to matter. She pushed herself to her feet, and that's when he noticed the red marks on her throat where his stubble had marked her. Wincing, he offered a half-hearted, sorry. She froze, staring down at him. Then, to his surprise, she broke into a smile. No, you're not. She leaned down and brushed a quick kiss across his lips. When she straightened, she winked. And I'm not either. I tell you, Seth, she blew out a breath and shook her head with a grin. You're dangerous. I am not. He struggled to his feet, his boots caught in the knitting and his jeans far too tight for any acrobatic maneuvers. I'm a gentleman. Yeah, you are, she said softly, as she took his hand. Sometimes I wish you weren't quite so much of a gentleman, but mostly I appreciate it. He wasn't sure what to say to that, so he kept his mouth shut. Now, are you finally going to show me what's back there? When she nodded over his shoulder, he turned, although he knew what she meant. They were currently standing in the family room at the front of the house, furnished with mismatched couches from his parents' house in Texas and various pieces he'd picked up here in Montana. The kitchen and dining room, with the powder room and laundry area off to one side, were in the middle of the house. Behind that a hallway led to the 3 bedrooms, which he had so far avoided giving her a tour of. Maybe not today. When she sighed dramatically, he knew she assumed he was just being gentlemanly again. But truthfully, he wasn't ready to show her his studio yet, wasn't ready to share his secret. Until he could be sure she was the one. Fine. Keep your dirty underwear or whatever hidden. If you're messy, I'm going to have to find out about it sometime, Seth. Especially if he ever wanted to show her his bedroom. They both heard the unspoken words, he was certain. But he just winced again, torn. She was watching him closely, and when he looked apologetically at her, she nodded, telling him she understood. But he didn't miss the flash of disappointment in her eyes. This time, her kiss was soft, and she didn't let it linger. I'll call you, Seth. Have an awesome evening. And then she was gone. He'd screwed up, he knew, but at least she hadn't counted him out entirely. He had to convince her to trust him. Just relax. Remember, she can sense your mood, Seth called softly, encouragingly from atop his horse. If you're nervous, she'll be antsy too. She can sense my mood? Aria muttered, glaring down at the freakishly tall horse she was perched on. It's her mood I'm worried about. What if she goes galloping off? She could hear the grin in Seth's voice when he answered. I won't let that happen. Looking up, she could see she'd been right. The man was smiling at her, but not in a condescending way. No, he looked almost excited. Excited to be sharing something he enjoyed with her. She knew that feeling exactly, because she'd felt the same way when he asked her to teach him to knit. Her heart had darn near melted. In fact, everything melted when he smiled at her like that. So she decided to trust him. With the horses, at least. Relaxing, she forced herself to take a deep breath. Okay, Mr. Cowboy. Lead the way. Nodding his approval, Seth showed her how to make the horse go forward, or whatever the correct term was. It was kinda like being on a rowboat in the ocean, with the waves rolling under her. What kind of gal lives in Montana her whole life and has never been on a horse before? One who didn't have a cowboy as dreamy as Seth Maestro to encourage her. He must have been thinking along the same lines, or at least, the first question, because he asked, You grew up in Black Aces, right? Right. It was easier to relax when she let the horse do its horsey thing, so she focused on Seth. My mom's family, the Hoyles, have been around for generations. My dad's family has a big dude ranch out in Idaho. River's End Ranch is insanely popular. He looked ridiculously at ease atop the horse, with one hand holding the ropey things, reins, she remembered, and the other resting on one powerful thigh. His hat was pushed high on his forehead, and she thought she might be able to look at him forever. You've got a bunch of siblings, right? I've met Artie once, but at the barbecue I saw you with another blonde. She nodded as she let her horse follow his along a hillside, leading toward a little clearing. Sometimes it's hard to keep track of us all. My mom was a classics major, so she named most of us after characters or gods from Greek literature. He nodded. My best friend, Blake, works for Wyatt Cauldron. He says Artie's real name is Artemis. Yep. And I'm Ariadne. He flashed her a grin. One of my favorite stories. Ariadne was the one who gave Theseus the string which helped him through the labyrinth and allowed him to defeat the Minotaur. It was one of my favorite stories when I was a kid. Dad used to read us the best versions of the Greek myths. Man, Theseus was always my favorite. Us? But before she could wonder about that, something else tugged at her memory. Theseus, hadn't she just heard the name Theseus recently? Oh, yeah, her sisters had teased her about the myth and the name at the barbecue, when they'd been listening to Kurt Theseus's music. Do all your names start with A? His question interrupted her pondering, and she lost the thread of her thought. Shaking her head, she tried to focus on the question. Yeah, mostly. Artie's twin brother is Apollo, although he goes by Pole. And Wyatt's best friend is Jax, my brother Ajax, but he would be mortified if he found out I was telling you that. She grinned and shrugged. But then, what are little sisters for, except annoying their big brothers? To her surprise, Seth didn't respond, didn't even look her way. She did that kicky thing she'd seen him do and urged her horse to move up beside his. Took a little more bouncing than she was comfortable with, and she was proud of the way she remembered to pull back on the reins to slow down the animal, becoming a regular cowgirl Aria. Seth? He was staring straight ahead, and the look on his face was. She swallowed. He looked so sad. But then he shook his head and smiled. It wasn't his normal smile. It was forced. For her benefit, she was certain. Yeah, sorry, he offered, then shook his head again. Just thinking. What had she said? But he changed the subject and nodded ahead. We're going to cross the river up there. Don't worry, it's shallow enough at this time of year that the horses won't have any trouble with it. I don't mind getting splashed, she offered. The ride was nice. The ranch really was beautiful, and he seemed to shake himself out of his funk to be the man she so enjoyed hanging out with. After a little while, he began to hum. She was surprised but didn't say anything. There was something about the way he was smiling softly, his eyes slightly unfocused when she glanced over at him, which told Aria he wasn't entirely conscious of his humming. Maybe it was just something he did when he wasn't paying attention. The thought made her smile. And after about a minute, she realized she recognized the song he was humming. What was it? Oh, it was that Kurt Theseus song she'd heard at the barbecue. The one which had been such a big hit last year. Maybe talking about the old Greek legends had triggered the memory for him or something. Whatever the reason, it was one of her favorites, and when he reached the chorus, Aria joined in. You make my heart beat faster, baby. You make me feel on fire. She belted out. You show me a flat pulse, and I'll call you a liar. Ain't no one out there who can make me feel like you. It was around this point that she realized he wasn't singing. In fact, he wasn't even looking at her. His cheeks had flushed and he was staring straight ahead. And the knuckles of his fingers were white around the reins. What's the matter? She asked, half defiant, half embarrassed to have done something so silly when he was obviously not impressed. He swallowed. Nothing. Then why aren't you looking at me? Chocolate brown eyes cut in her direction, and he forced a smile. Nothing's wrong. I liked hearing you sing. I don't believe you. When he raised a brow, she stuck out her chin. You obviously knew the song. He glanced back ahead. Yeah, well, Kurt Theseus is one of my favorites, Anne. Really? Seth's head whipped around again. He is? Yeah. Are you sure you don't want to sing with me? This time, his smile seemed a little easier. Like he was confessing something. Sorry. Seth shook his head a little sadly, that apologetic still in place. I don't think that's a good idea. Well, maybe the guy just had a horrible singing voice. It wasn't the first time she'd heard Seth humming, and she remembered he'd told her that his mom had been a band teacher, so maybe he was musically talented, but just couldn't sing worth a lick, and was embarrassed to share. She snorted softly as they continued the ride. It's not like her singing voice was any better. But after a few minutes of riding in silence, he glanced over at her and began to hum again. It was like he was testing her. She narrowed her eyes, listening to the tune. It took her a moment to recognize it as one of Kurt Theseus's older songs. Seth was testing her. And he must know the artist's songs as well as she did. So she stuck out her tongue at him and began to sing along. I'm a simple country boy who likes simple country toys, like pickups with Bluetooth in the cab. But later on in life I'd much rather have a wife. She broke off when he started chuckling, and soon she was giggling along too. You do know Kurt Theseus's music, she accused. He just shrugged and sent her a teasing grin. He's all right, I suppose. They spent the next part of the ride humming songs back and forth, testing one another's knowledge of popular country songs from the last decade, but when he urged his horse up rocky path to a little rise, and she found herself looking down at a cluster of buildings at the end of a dirt road, the game ended. Isn't that your house? She pointed. Yep. That one's Blake's, he works at the track, and Rusty lives beside him. There's a whole bunch of us who work for the Caudrons who live here. The oldest ones are close to 70 years old. Apparently, even a few generations ago, the Caudrons recognized that some of their hands wouldn't be satisfied in the bunkhouse, and built these. Most of the hands rent, which I did for a while, but then I bought mine outright. I figure eventually I'll retire and just hang around the ranch, like the old-timers do. She was studying the layout. It looks like a nice little neighborhood. I like that there's so much shade. Are there any children? A few. He pointed to two of the larger houses. Families tend to get the 3 bedrooms, but I was lucky enough to snag one. I hope to bring Mom to live with me one day. He had a 3-bedroom house, she knew, but he'd always made an excuse not to show her around each time she'd visited. At first, she assumed it was because he was embarrassed, but now she wasn't so certain. There was something itching at the back of her mind, something which had been active since Henry had lied to her. It was an instinct telling her Seth was keeping a secret, and she didn't like that. Because she was truthful and knew there was no hope of a relationship if he was keeping secrets from her. And to her surprise, she very, very much wanted a relationship with this man. But he was still telling her about the group of houses. See, there's more being built on the far side. The way I understand it, the Caudrons have been building a few every few years, and there's a long waiting list. I spent 4 years in the bunkhouse before I moved out here. It's nice, she managed, offering a smile she didn't quite feel. I like your house a lot. Way nicer than my apartment, at least, and it's a cute little community. Thanks. I like it a lot too. It's home, you know? He grinned and seemed to hold himself straighter as he pulled the rein things to make his horse move away from the ridge. She followed him. They were almost back to the stable when she asked him, "So, what do you want to do tomorrow, after church?" He hesitated, and when she glanced at him, his expression had closed off. "I can't." Her brows rose. "You don't want to hang out with me?" "I do." His response was immediate, and he turned in the saddle as if making sure she understood. "I do. But it's the first weekend of the month, and I..." Shaking his head, he turned back to face their path. "I have something I have to do," he mumbled. "A secret." She pressed her lips closed, irritated she'd been right. He was keeping a secret. Was it the reason he refused to show her his house? Was he seeing someone else instead? Like Henry had been? There'd been plenty of times, at the end of their relationship, when he'd told her he couldn't hang out or take her out on a date. Later she'd discovered that had been when he was seeing the other woman. She glanced at Seth. He was flushed, staring straight ahead, almost refusing to meet her eyes. "Seth," she prompted quietly. "Are you seeing another woman?" He whipped his head around so quickly his horse reacted, prancing quickly to the side. He had to shush it, and patted its neck, while she remembered how to stop her own animal. "How could you ask me that, Aria?" he finally said. "I haven't even thought of another woman since I met you. I like you." She blinked. "And we've been spending a lot of time together. But now you won't tell me what you've got planned tomorrow, and I thought we were being honest with one another." Maybe that had been a manipulative dig, but it worked. Wincing, he met her eyes. "Aria, it's just something I have to take care of. Once a month, when the weather is nice." She held his gaze. "Can I come with you? I like doing things with you. I like being part of your life." Maybe he heard the unspoken words, because he blew out a breath and looked away. "Seth, if we're going to have a future together, you can't keep secrets from me." He winced again. Then he dragged his hat from his head and ran his hand through his hair, tugging at the waves the way she'd done each time he'd kissed her. "You want to come with me? You want to see what I'm doing?" She nodded silently. He closed his eyes and blew out a slow breath. "Fine," he whispered. "I'll pick you up at 1 o'clock, and you can learn my secret." She should have been satisfied, but there was just enough of a hitch in his voice that she wondered what she was about to learn. And if it was his only secret. Chapter 5. "Have some more rice, honey." Seth rolled his eyes at his mother, across the table. "Mom, I like the red beans more than the rice. You know that." That's why, when she'd called yesterday to ask him what he wanted for lunch on Sunday after church, he'd requested his favorite. Grinning unrepentantly, she nudged the rice bowl toward him. And you know I can't handle too much leftover rice. Mr. Popolopodowski prefers the red beans too, so he won't finish off the rice either. With a dramatic sigh, Seth reached for the bowl. So I have to finish it, huh? Fine. He scooped more rice into his bowl, and mock glared at his mother, who smiled, satisfied. Of course, when he bit into the red beans and rice, he closed his eyes on a happy sigh. They might be living in Montana, land of the red meat, but dang could his mother cook his childhood favorites. She put just the right amount of spice in, when she set the slow cooker going before Sunday morning church. So, he swallowed. You're still seeing Mr. Popolopodowski? Popolopodowski, dear. Yes, Alfred is a sweetheart, although I'm not seeing him, per se. She fiddled with her spoon. We're just friends. And neighbors. Have I told you how much I love this apartment complex? Seth grinned, because he knew she wasn't looking at him. Every time we chat, yeah. Although I think that's just your way of saying you're not ready to come out to the ranch to live with me. She scoffed, then scowled at him. His mother had just turned 60, not old by any stretch, and her dark hair had gone salt and pepper a few years ago. She was still the feistiest lady he knew, and Seth adored her. Of course I don't want to come live with you, dear. I love you, but why in the world would I want to live in the middle of nowhere, surrounded by cowboys? Hey! He pointed his spoon at his mom. I'm a cowboy. And Rusty's a cowgirl. There's a few of them. She rolled her eyes. I'm happy here, dear. You're the one who needs a companion to live with. You've got that large house and no one to share it with, and I'm not trying to talk you into getting a dog. Her expression turned nonchalant as she bent over her bowl. What about this Aria you've been seeing? He could tell where she was going with this line of questions, and luckily, he agreed. I like her a lot, Mom. Like her enough to maybe ask her to move in with you? I like her enough to ask her to marry me. His mom sucked in a breath and jerked up straight, her brown eyes searching his, as if looking for the joke. Slowly, her shoulders relaxed. You mean it, honey? You love her? Love her? The moment he'd seen her, he'd known she was special. The moment he'd learned her name, he'd known they were meant to be together. But did he love her? I think I do, Mom, he whispered. She reached across the table and patted his hand. Then I look forward to meeting her, Seth. He swallowed down his emotion. Yeah, I'd like that, too. So tell me what you two have been up to. They spent the rest of the meal chatting about Seth's recent dates. Mom was impressed he was learning to knit, although he didn't confess how he wanted to help Aria out with her inventory. She chuckled at the idea of Aria learning to ride, and he kept her smiling with stories of the two of them together. When their simple, but amazing, meal was done, he cleaned the table, rinsed the dishes, and loaded them in the dishwasher. Then he ducked into her bathroom and got changed out of his church clothes, and into his jeans and t-shirt. Mom eyed him when he emerged, but didn't say anything. Instead, she held up a plastic container with leftovers. Can I send this home with you? Alfred and I don't need to. He was already shaking his head. Thanks, but no. It'll have to sit in the car all day. He saw the moment she realized what day it was and saw the disappointment in her eyes as she lowered the container. Oh, honey. You still do that? He knew his mom didn't approve. But that was okay, he didn't do it for her. Yeah, Mom, he said in a low voice, folding his blue button-up shirt and shoving it into the gym bag he'd brought. It's something I have to do. I owe it to. Automatically, his eyes darted to the framed photo hanging on the wall. It was a portrait done of their family in happier times. All four of them were smiling at the camera, and the sight made him both happy and unbelievably sad. When he looked back at his mother, her lips were curled upward, but her smile was sad. What would your Aria say about this strange obsession, Seth? She murmured. My Aria. She was the song in his heart. He took a deep breath and straightened. She's coming with me today. He met his mom's eyes. So she'll either think it's creepy as hell, or she'll understand why I have to do it. Mom slowly nodded, her expression turning thoughtful. I think that is a really good idea, honey. Let me know how it goes, please? Mutely, he nodded, then leaned down when she gestured, so she could kiss his cheek. He enveloped her in a hug, thankful she was part of his life, then set her back. Love you, Mom. I love you too, honey. Good luck. With a smile he didn't quite feel, he waved to her and headed out the door. Good luck? He'd need it. Aria's stomach was in knots by the time she jogged out of her apartment to meet Seth's truck. Now that she knew he wasn't an ex-murderer, she'd given him her address to pick her up for dates a few times, but couldn't remember feeling this way since the beginning of that first fateful date. Her last first date? Maybe, depending on what his secret was. He didn't say much when he held the door open for her, but offered her a tight smile. As they headed out of town, she tried to search for some indication of what they'd be doing that day. Some hint at his secret. A Kurt Theseus song came on the radio, and he leaned over and punched the button to turn the whole thing off, plunging the cab into silent awkwardness. Nervously, she began to rub at one of her palms. Truthfully, now that she was getting regular hand and wrist massages from Seth, they didn't hurt as much. But some habits were hard to break. His right hand closed around hers, and she glanced at him in surprise. He was still staring straight ahead, watching the road, but his strong thumb began to make small circles against her palm, and she melted at his touch. When she sighed, he shot her another smile, but there was a touch of sadness to it. Did you have a good morning? She asked, desperate to alleviate the awkwardness. Yeah. Pastor Dinkelheimler's sermon was all about acceptance and loving your neighbor, but afterward he kept licking his fingers and sticking them in the air when one of the cauldrons stopped to talk to him. His chuckle seemed a little forced. I guess I'm lucky their unluckiness doesn't apply to those of us who work for them, too. Yeah, I guess so. Aria lapsed into silence. After, I had lunch with Mom. She gave me grief for not bringing you by to meet her. Seth glanced over at her. Would you like to meet her? A big part of Aria jumped at the thought of meeting his mom, of taking that next step in their relationship. But the part that remembered what Henry had done held her back. If Seth's secret was going to come between them, she'd rather not get too attached to his mother. And it would all depend on whatever he was about to reveal. So she just hummed and said, maybe. He nodded once, jerkily, as if he understood but didn't like it. They didn't speak anymore as he turned down that same backcountry road they'd taken on their way home from their first date. Where they'd kissed for the first time. But after only a few minutes, Seth pulled the truck over to the side of the road, as far as possible. He turned off the truck and shot her an unreadable look. Was he nervous too? Taking a deep breath, he nodded once more, then climbed out. Curious, she followed, and watched him take a plastic bin from the bed of the truck, then start tromping through the tall grass and weeds along the road. He was headed for a white wooden cross, a memorial marker for someone killed along the road. She didn't say anything, but moved around him to read the name. Daniel Landry, 1952 to 1999. Don't drink and drive. Swallowing down her emotion and confusion, she saw Seth sink to one knee beside the new-looking cross. He pulled on a pair of gloves from the bin, and began pulling out the weeds beside the marker. Aria frowned, trying to understand, but not wanting to interfere. Did he know Daniel? Surely the man died before he'd even arrived in Montana, right? But the cross looked new, newer than the decades it had been since the man's death. Without looking at her, Seth stood, lifted the bin, and walked back toward the truck. She followed, more confused than ever. But he didn't load the bin back into the truck, he kept walking. Around the bend where he'd parked the pickup, there was another cross. This one was in worse shape than the first one, the words harder to read. Our Joshua. There were no dates, but Seth pulled a rag from his bin, sprayed it with a cleaner, and wiped the dirt off the words, making sure to get in between the letters. When he was finished, it didn't exactly gleam, but the memorial looked a little neater. Then he pulled up the weeds, straightened the rocks around the cross, picked up the trash around the site, and sat back on his heels. Taking a deep breath, he reached into his bin and pulled out a can of Diet Mountain Dew, which he placed at the base of the cross, between two rocks. When he stood, carrying the bin, and met her eyes, Aria saw the challenge there. Defiance. He expected her to say something about this odd habit. But she wasn't sure how to ask. So instead, she said, "Diet Mountain Dew?" He lifted his chin. "Someone else placed one here, years ago. I figured that meant he liked them, so I keep up the tradition." Oh. When she didn't say anything else, he stepped around her and headed for the truck. She followed in silence, a theory forming in her mind. He didn't know Joshua, he couldn't have known Daniel. He hadn't known Amanda, but he cared for her memorial marker all the same. Neither spoke as they climbed back into the truck and he eased out onto the road once more. Had he made Daniel's new cross? Did anyone else come to care for these markers? Anyone besides Seth? Why, that was the real question, wasn't it? When they reached Amanda's marker, she wasn't really surprised. This time he didn't park so close to the rocky hillside, so she was able to climb out and follow him. This time, she eyed the memorial carefully. Amanda's cross didn't have any weeds, had he pulled them the last time they were here, and the wood seemed freshly painted. He set down the bin, and before he could sink to one knee, she stopped him with a touch on his forearm. When he glanced at her, she held his gaze. "Can I help?" she asked in a low voice. Surprise flashed in those chocolate eyes of his, then he dropped his chin. He bent down and pulled out some yellow silk roses and a zip tie. "Here," he said, his beautiful voice sounding hoarse. She might have liked these. Amanda Smith. Aria didn't know her story, but she read her name and said a prayer for the young woman's soul as she carefully affixed the flowers to one arm of the cross, then fanned them out artistically. Seth surprised her when he sank to both knees beside her, holding a toy stuffed cat. It was pink, with disproportionately big eyes, and was likely supposed to be cute. He ripped the tag off, had he purchased it just for this, and shoved it in his pocket. Then, taking a deep breath, he leaned forward and arranged the stuffed animal at the base of the cross. Kneeling there, in front of a memorial for a girl she never knew, Aria felt her eyes fill with tears. "That's cute," she managed. "Yeah." Seth was still staring at the cross. "I saw it the other day and thought she'd like it." "I thought you said you didn't know her." "I didn't know her," he whispered. When he pushed himself to his feet, she scrambled up after him, determined to learn his secret. "Seth." She grabbed his hand, and when he swung around, she saw tears in his eyes too. "Tell me," she pleaded. His gaze darted from her to the cross to the bin, and back again. "No one else takes care of these," he finally said. "I guess they don't matter to the family as much, after a while." He shrugged and looked off across the road. "I guess they focus on maintaining the grave. But I've seen plenty of memorial crosses along the roads where people do care for them," she argued. "I don't bother with those." Once a month. "Once a month, you clean up the markers that aren't cared for, right?" When he didn't answer, didn't even look at her, she pushed on. "You didn't know them, but you come out here and take care of them and think about them, don't you?" Finally, he met her eyes, and although he'd blinked away the tears, she saw sadness and desperation in his gaze. "Why, Seth," she whispered. His gaze drifted away from her, to land on Amanda's cross. "I had a little sister." "Oh God, no." Her hold tightened on his hand, and she swallowed down her sob at what she knew what was coming. "Hannah was a few years younger than me, and liked to party. I always took care of her, but we went to different colleges, and I couldn't keep an eye on her. She was 22 when she died. She'd been drinking at a college party and insisted she could drive home. Wrapped her car around a tree." He'd told the story so dispassionately, but his tone was belied by the way he clutched at her hand. I'm sorry, Seth," she managed, surprised to feel the tears rolling down her cheeks. He shrugged. Thankfully she was alone. She would have hated knowing she'd hurt someone else with her stupidity. Was that supposed to be a joke? Reaching up, she touched his cheek, urging him to turn back to her. "Seth," she made that choice. It's not your fault. I know, he said hoarsely. I know. It's been years, and I know that. She wouldn't let him look away. But it bothers you that you can't take care of her now, right? His voice was a whisper when he said, she's buried in Texas, with Dad. And somewhere, on the side of the road, there's a marker with her name on it, isn't there? When his eyes squeezed closed, 2 fat tears ran down his cheeks. She ached to find a way to comfort him. This was his secret. His secret was that he was noble, and kind, and had a heart as big as Montana. You take care of Amanda's marker, the same way you'd take care of Hannah's. Her eyes drifted to the stuffed cat. You bring her things you think Hannah would like. He didn't open his eyes when he whispered, I take care of Amanda's in the hopes that someone is taking care of Hannah's. Seth, she whispered, every time someone drives past, they read her name, and they think of her, if only for a moment. And that's important. His eyes opened, and stared into hers for a long moment. It is important. I don't want her, or any of them, to be forgotten. She managed a small smile before she threw her arms around his middle and pressed her cheek against his shoulder. It was a moment before she felt him wrap her in a hug in return, but they stood like that a long time, sharing strength. After a while, she felt him inhale shakily. When she pulled back, he seemed more composed. This is my secret, he said softly. I know it's a little weird. No, it's not. When she saw the way he lifted a brow, she smiled. Okay, yes, it is a little weird. But it's wonderful too. She lifted her hand to his cheek. You have a beautiful heart, Seth Maestro. He looked surprised, so she pulled her other hand free and placed it on the other cheek. He shifted his hold until his hands were on her hips, and when he smiled slightly, she pulled his face down for a kiss. For a moment, they both forgot all about the cross, and Amanda, and Hannah, and the world. They just shared their joys, and their strength, and their tears. And Aria knew the truth. Seth, she pulled away, but kept her hands on his cheek so she could hold his gaze. Seth Maestro, you are a kind man with a good heart. I think I started falling in love with you that very first day. Right here. Where you kissed me for the first time. His eyes had widened. What did you say? She'd said a lot of things, but she knew what he was asking. I love you, Seth. I love you, and I'm glad to know someone as sweet and wonderful as you. A slow smile crept across his face. You love me? I hadn't exactly planned on it, but yes. She returned his grin. I love you, and now usually it's traditional for you to say something in return. His kiss was hard and fast, and when he straightened, her arms were around his neck and she was breathing heavily. I love you, Aria Weston. You're the song in my heart. How could an Aria and a maestro not fall in love? When he picked her off the ground and spun her around, Aria's giggles burst out of her, and she held on for dear life. An Aria and a maestro. He was right, they did belong together. His second kiss was softer, slower. I love you, Aria, he murmured against her lips. And I love you, she sighed. Thank you for sharing your secret with me. He didn't reply, but his smile suddenly seemed a little fixed. Why? Because she'd mentioned his secret? He had shared it with her, hadn't he? Or was there another secret? But they loved one another, and that was what was important. Love is about being honest with one another. The reminder nagged at her, and she tried to shush her subconscious, tried to tell it not to ruin a lovely moment. But the little bit of doubt was still there. If he loves me, he should tell me all his secrets. Chapter 6. Seth leaned forward and used the mouse to adjust the pitch shift, then strummed the chord again. This time the computer's display showed it recording correctly. There's a song running through my head. There's a feeling running through my heart. He kept an eye on the screen as he sang, and was pleased with how everything looked. He could recall a time when all of his adjustments had to be done with knobs and levers. Some of the old-school artists still recorded that way, but he'd switched over to computer programs early on, because they were cheaper and required less equipment. Of course, this program was still state-of-the-art. He spent his first $100,000 on the down payment for this house, his mom's apartment, and a new truck, but his second went to equipment. Now he could make every song he needed to make, even those requiring backup or other instruments, from this spare bedroom in his house. It was lined with soundproofing and padding to eliminate reverb and echo, and also contained all of his filming equipment and backdrops, for when he wanted to post videos. And his masks, of course. His entire life, he'd wanted to play music, but had no interest in the fame which came with success. Seth knew he was good but didn't see any need to go on tour or receive adulations or whatnot. The money was nice, yeah, but he didn't need it. He was a simple southern boy who was happy with his life as a cowboy. He didn't need all the complications which came with fame. He strummed, "It's the kind of tune without an end, but I don't know how to start." His first videos, he hadn't even shown his face, the camera had been pointed at his chin and torso. When he'd gone on that reality show, he'd welcomed the chance to wear the mask, and then had freaked out when told to remove it. He was happy being the masked singer and keeping his secret. Under his agitated fingers, the strings clanged in discord, and he tossed the pick down with a frustrated sigh. His secret. He didn't see any need to reveal his secret, except to Aria. His Aria. He loved her, and he was keeping a secret from her. Whether or not she realized it, it was galling to him that, as much as she valued honesty, here he was, basically lying to her. He was going to have to tell her. "Hey, man, you in here?" Blake's call had him setting aside the guitar. In the studio, he hollered back. His best friend knocked on the door, then pushed it open. His aqua eyes took in the bright lights. Seth invariably was sweating in all of his videos, between them and the mask, and the fancy computer cooling system. "You remember we have a game tonight?" he prodded. Seth nodded. "Yeah, I was just fiddling around. No recording. Just trying to get a song right. My Aria. The one he'd written for her." He might have shrugged nonchalantly, but his friend knew him too well. Blake peered at him with narrowed eyes. "What's wrong?" he asked quietly. Seth knew better than to deny it. Blowing out a frustrated breath, he looked around the studio. "Just thinking about all this. And my secret." He hadn't talked to Blake much about what was going on with Aria, but apparently, he didn't need to. His friend was something of an expert on women, especially when it came to how many he'd dated over the years. Humming thoughtfully, Blake folded his arms and leaned a hip against the doorframe. "You haven't told Aria yet, have you?" Seth shook his head and carefully placed his guitar on the stand. "I haven't known her too long." His friend didn't say anything for a while, and when Seth glanced his way, Blake was frowning at him. "What?" His friend shrugged. "First time you saw her, you told me you were going to marry her." "Yeah." Seth turned to his computer and began saving and shutting down programs. "So?" Blake asked. "So, what?" "So, how's that going? Have you convinced her you're not a creep?" A slow smile crept across Seth's face as he remembered the way she'd kissed him last Sunday. Taking her with him when he'd went on one of his trips to maintain the markers had been a big risk. She could have thought him a creep. It had been slightly terrifying to reveal that side of him to her. But she'd understood. She'd kissed him. She'd told him she loved her. Ah. Blake straightened. "So it's going well, apparently?" "I love her, man." Seth met the other man's eyes, and let his grin prove it. "And she told me she loves me." The other man rolled his eyes just slightly. "Well then, sounds like wedding bells are just around the corner, huh?" Seth's smile faded. "She doesn't know about all this." His hand swept around the studio. Scowling now, at himself, he used his computer to shut down the bright lights. "She let me know from the very beginning that honesty is important to her, and I haven't told her about this." Which, of course, had been Blake's guess as soon as he walked in. The man might be a charming flirt, but he sure did know what made people tick, huh? "And that's a problem," Blake finished. "You can't marry her if she doesn't know your secret, but you don't trust her enough." "I trust her." Seth whirled around. I trust her enough to tell her about Hannah and he shook his head and leaned forward, bracing his elbows on his knees. I love her, and I want to marry her, he finished in a whisper. So you're going to have to tell her. Yeah. Yeah, I am. But how? Seth was staring at the floor, but he saw Blake's boots step closer. You've got that show in Missoula next week. Remember? I helped set it up. Oh, yeah. Seth hadn't forgotten the show, but had forgotten he'd originally gotten it because Blake had been trying to charm the bar's owner, and had mentioned he'd had an in with Kurt Theseus, the masked country star. So, Seth lifted his head. You're going to be there? With the owner? Nah, man, that fling was over months ago. I figured I'd meet up with one of my gals from town. Or maybe I'll take your mother. Seth's brow twitched. His mom had taken right to Blake when they'd been introduced, and more often than not, treated the other man like another son. She'd like that. Mom was the only other person who knew his secret. What were you planning on telling Aria? About where you'd be next Saturday? Seth honestly hadn't thought of it. But his friend was right, he'd been spending every available hour with her, and she'd surely notice when he disappeared for most of the day. And he wasn't going to lie to her. Maybe this show was exactly what he needed. You're wearing your I'm about to be brilliant expression, man. Seth grinned up at his friend. Maybe I'm about to make the biggest mistake of my life. You're going to tell her, aren't you? I'm going to show her. And maybe prove how much he loved her, in the meantime. He was taking a real risk. If Aria took the knowledge of his identity public, Seth Maestro would never have another moment of peace. He'd have to become Kurt Theseus, at least until he faded from popularity. But he knew her. He knew her well enough to take the risk. If he couldn't convince her to marry him, to make his secret her own, then he trusted her enough not to go public, not to screw him over. But he had to hope and pray it wouldn't come to that. Because he needed her to say yes. Blake didn't respond for a long moment. Then his friend dropped his chin once, in a serious nod. Well, all right, he drawled. You need my help? Yeah, Seth stood up. Yeah, I think I do. Okay. You've got about 30 minutes to lay it on me before Rusty shows up for poker night. You know she's always early, and hungry. Aaron's bringing the food tonight. Wyatt texted and said he's going out with Artie, so he's out. The others will probably show up around 7:30. Seth was grinning, his heart pounding out the rhythm he'd been matching earlier as he'd played what would be his next hit. He knew this would work. Why do we always have to do this in my apartment? Artie swatted at Aria's hands when she reached up toward the shower cap. Because I might not live in a van anymore, but I do share a one-room apartment with my husband, and Wyatt doesn't need to know about this part of my life. Athena says the fumes give her headaches, and Lainey doesn't color her hair, so sees no reason to stink up her apartment, their younger sister drawled as she lazily turned a page in a magazine. I'm just here for the snacks. In the mirror over the sink, Aria and Artie exchanged a smirk. I don't like to color my hair, Athena said with a sigh from her spot where she lounged on the bed, her cap already in place. It's messing with nature, which is never good. But I just look so much better as a blonde. Most of the Weston siblings were some variation of blonde. Artie was the lightest, so her idea of dyeing her hair usually meant some sort of highlight. Aria's natural color was a little darker, closer to Jax's, but she liked to lighten it so she could add color to it. Although she was all blonde now, she'd had pink tips earlier in the summer. Athena, as their resident hippie, would likely prefer to rub nature stuff on her head. Yeah, quipped Artie, as she shook the box at their sister. It's a real shame I have newt or llama poop or clovers picked by a full moon don't quite give you the same color convenience store-bought chemicals do. As Athena scoffed, Lainey chuckled. She's not a witch, Artemis. Just in tune with nature. Sounds awfully witchy to me, Artie said with a wink in the mirror at Aria. Aria tried to smile back, but knew it was forced. First of all, I would never hurt a poor defenseless newt, Athena began, but Artie's laughter interrupted her. But you're okay with llama poop? Idly, Lainey flipped the page. Dung has all sorts of useful applications. Not sure about as a hair remedy, though. Athena was looking thoughtful when Artie focused on Aria's hair, but muttered, leave it to Lainey to know all about poop applications. Lainey, Atlanta, was Athena's twin, although they didn't look much alike. It could have also been their personalities. Lainey was their academic, the one who never stopped learning, even though she'd been out of school for several years. She could have gone on to grad school, but instead had returned home to Montana to become a social worker. She said she liked knowing she was making a difference in the world, and Aria had to admire that. So, Artie finished Aria's hair, and poked her in the shoulder. What are we doing this time? Wanna go back to pink tips, or just leave it plain? A few times in the last weeks, Seth had mentioned how much he liked her hair. Aria sighed. Let's just leave it plain this time. Maybe I'll do blue next time. She was an artist. She liked change. So how come there was this knot of worry in the pit of her stomach? Lainey flipped another page. Are you going to tell us what's wrong, or do we have to drag it out of you? Aria's head jerked up in surprise the same moment Athena blurted, nothing's wrong. What makes you think anything's wrong? Everything's going swimmingly, who said it wasn't? Twisting in her seat, Aria saw Lainey and Artie blinking at Athena. Okay, Lainey drawled, that was an interesting reaction. Pretty sure she was talking about Aria, Artie said with a raised brow, but we are 100% coming back to that denial, Athena. What denial? Everything's fine, denied Athena. See? I'm good. A little desperately, she turned her gaze on Aria, but now that you mention it, Ariadne has seemed a little piqued. Her aura has gone pink again, which is good, but today she seems off. Lainey muttered hippie under her breath as Artie crossed her arms. She rested her hip against the bathroom counter and pinned Aria with a stare. So, are you going to tell us what's up? Athena and I were there when you met Seth, remember? You've been all giddy and in love for the last few weeks, and we figured you were finally over what that pig Henry did. I am, whispered Aria, dropping her gaze to her lap, where her fingers were clutching one another. I was. Do you love him? Came Artie's quiet question. Aria sighed and admitted the truth. Yeah, I do. I told him. When she peeked up, her older sister was nodding. And what did he say when you told him that? He told me he loved me. Lainey tossed the magazine aside and swung her legs off Aria's bed. So what's the problem? Why are you looking like that time you had to eat one of Athena's brownies and accidentally swallowed 6 eyes of newt? I don't use eye of newt. It's endangering the local newt ecosystem, her twin screeched, throwing a pillow at Lainey's head. Dodging the pillow, Lainey smirked slightly. Well, whatever it was slimy and tasted gross. They were tapioca balls. And now Aria looks like you fed her. Shut up. Ew, no, don't hex me. Lainey shot back. Hiding her chuckles, Artie tried for a stern look. Lainey, she's not a witch. Athena, your brownies were disgusting. And Aria. What's the problem? You love each other. Seth's a much better guy than Henry ever was. I know, Aria agreed softly. Wyatt took me out to dinner on Monday. We came here to Black Aces because I refused to go out to eat in Caudron Valley, what with all the finger-licking they do, and missed his weekly poker night with the guys. We ended up talking about Seth and how happy he seems lately. We both agree that he meant it when he proposed to you, even though it was ridiculous. Athena was nodding. Who proposes the moment they meet a person? Ridiculous. My point is, that if he was willing to propose then, and he obviously really cares for you, then there's a future ahead of you. Assuming you want a future with him? Artie finished quietly. Still staring at her hands, Aria took a deep breath. You know, whenever we'd read those romance novels, and talk about them after. Remember the one thing I couldn't stand? When she looked up, her sisters were nodding. Lainey said, you always hated it when the characters kept secrets from one another. Honesty is important, Athena agreed. A dishonest person has a dark aura. Artie dropped a hand to Aria's shoulder. Is Seth keeping secrets from you? Last weekend, she would have said yes. Seth had obviously been hiding something big. But she'd pushed, and he'd finally invited her along. She'd ridden with him as he cared for 24 memorial markers along the highways and back roads of their area, tending to and remembering names of people he never knew. And he'd told her about Hannah, and his memories of her, and the way he'd mourned. It had been gut-wrenching and freeing and exhausting and exhilarating, all at once. She'd held his hand as he'd mourned, and she'd mourned with him, she'd kissed him, she'd declared her love for him, and they'd reached a new level in their relationship. But when she'd asked him about other secrets, he hadn't met her eyes. I think he is. He shared so much of himself, and I'm honored that he's told me his secrets. She wouldn't tell her sisters those secrets, though, because some things were sacred. But I think he's holding something back. Why do you think he's doing that? Asked Lainey quietly. Because he doesn't trust you? Or because he thinks you're better off not knowing? Athena asked. Or because he thinks you knowing will change your opinion of him? Artie finished. I don't know, whispered Aria. Artie squeezed her shoulder. Well, you have to figure it out. There might be a good reason for keeping a secret from you. There's never a good reason for lying to someone you love. Aria snapped back. Lainey was nodding. If you love him, and want a future with him, you need answers. We don't have to be satisfied, remember that. You're the one who needs to hear him and be okay with the answers, whether he tells you his secrets or not. It was good advice, of course. Lainey was good at things like that. Unconsciously, Aria rotated her wrists, glad they didn't hurt quite as much as they used to. So what are you going to do? Asked Athena quietly. He's asked me out this weekend. I got the impression it was something different than our usual dinner dates. He told me we're heading into Missoula. Lainey whistled quietly. That's a special date, all right. Aria nodded. I don't know what the plan is, but I'll ask him then. Ask him what secrets he's keeping? Athena asked. When Aria nodded, Artie squeezed her shoulder again. And what happens if he tells you he's not keeping any secrets from you? He was. Aria knew it. Being lied to by Henry had made her skittish, all right, and hesitant to trust again. For a while, she wondered if that experience was what was causing her to be so certain Seth was still not telling her everything. But she'd decided it wasn't her imagination. She met her older sister's eyes. If he tells me he's not keeping a secret, then he's lying. I know he is. Artie slowly nodded, and Aria took a deep breath. And if he keeps lying to me, that means we don't have any hope at a future together. Chapter 7. Strangest double date ever. Seth's mother was sitting in the back seat with Blake, chatting away about his latest date and the plans for the rodeo in September. And Seth's hands were locked on the steering wheel at 10-2, praying he was about to do the right thing. He was pretty sure the ring was burning a hole in his pocket. We're here, lover boy, Blake called out unhelpfully after they'd been sitting in the parking lot in front of Aria's apartment for about a minute. I know, growled Seth, forcing himself to let go of the wheel and unbuckle his belt. He slammed the door shut on the sound of his best friend's laughter and marched toward her front door. She looked amazing, of course. He had some trouble making his voice work when she answered the door. All he'd told her about tonight was that they were going to see a show in Missoula, and she was dressed appropriately in a pair of jeans that hugged all her curves in the best way, and a shirt tied at her midriff. You look, he shook his head. Wow. Your hair looks great. It was in her usual 2 braids, but looked different somehow. Did you do something new with it? She blushed, but was smiling when she turned to lock the door behind her. A lady doesn't reveal all her secrets. Secrets. That's what tonight was about, wasn't it? Maybe she realized what she'd said, because when she turned around, she was looking a little guilty. I mean, she grabbed his hand before they could move off her porch. I'd rather not reveal all of my beauty regimen, but if you really want to know. What are you talking about? I think honesty's important, Seth, and I don't want you to think I'm keeping secrets from you. So, she took a breath and straightened her shoulders. My hair isn't really this light. It's a dark blonde, but I lighten it with highlights. He wanted to smile, but he'd heard the emphasis she'd placed on certain words. She knew he was keeping a secret from him. So, he leaned in and brushed a kiss across her lips. I think you're beautiful no matter what, Aria. If you didn't dye your hair, I'd still think the same. She stared up at him, her blue eyes darting between his as if looking for the truth. I love you, she finally whispered. I love you too. She didn't say anything else as he led her back to the truck. The bed was filled with his equipment and a suitcase with his gear, the t-shirt, hat and mask he wore on stage among them, which she eyed curiously but didn't ask about. In an effort to distract her, he wrenched open the door. Aria, this is my mom, Marcia. Mom, this is Aria. Aria looked taken aback. Hello. She shot him a glance. I didn't expect to meet you tonight. While Mom wiggled her fingers in greeting, Blake leaned forward. It's a double date. I'm Seth's best friend Blake. As she shook Blake's hand and said, I remember you from the barbecue, Seth hurried around to the driver's side. They made awkward small talk, about the weather, of all things, until he merged onto the highway. Then the conversation lapsed. Aria had lowered her sun visor and he watched the way she kept glancing in the mirror at the pair behind them. I hope you don't mind, Seth said in a low voice, knowing good and well Mom and Blake could hear them. Since we were all going to the same show, I thought it'd be okay if we went together. Truthfully, he was just too nervous to go alone. Mom and Blake went to a lot of his shows, since he only did a few local events, and they were the only two who knew his secret. Having them in the truck with him meant Seth didn't have to spend the 2-hour drive fretting about what would happen tonight. He was either going to win her heart for good, or lose her completely when she discovered the magnitude of his secret. But she smiled tightly, probably completely aware they couldn't speak privately. It's cool. I'm glad I get to meet your mom, finally. She twisted in the seat so she could smile more gently at the older woman. Seth's told me a lot about you. How about me? Blake butted in. Mom smacked his arm. Don't be self-centered, Blake. No one wants to talk about you. Seth snorted. Especially not to a woman I'm trying to make like me. The banter seemed to set Aria at ease. Her smile seemed genuine now. I like you fine, Seth. And I like you fine, too. Ah, true love, Blake sighed dramatically, slouching back and clutching his heart. Such romance. Seth scowled at him in the rearview mirror, which caused him to grin. Mom smacked him again. It is romantic, which you might appreciate if you managed to take one woman out more than once. As Aria giggled, Blake protested. Hey, I've taken a girl out more than once. No, I'm almost certain. There was that waitress at, no, never mind. Mom made a sound somewhere between laughter and a dismissive snort, and Aria pulled her legs up to twist further in the seat. So, where are we going? She asked. Missoula, Seth answered. There's a nightclub there where Blake has an inn. I got the tickets, his best friend butted in. We're going to see Kurt Theseus. Aria gasped. Are you kidding? He's my favorite country singer. I love him. Seth managed a little grin, although it probably looked sickly. I remember. She bounced a little in the seat. My sisters tease me about it too, because of the names. Mom leaned forward, so Seth could just see her from the corner of his eyes. What about your names? My name's Ariadne. Blake groaned. If any more of you Westons show up in Caudron Valley, I'm going to have to buy a book on Greek mythology, aren't I? Artemis and Ariadne, who's next? Mom gave a little hum, then chuckled. Ariadne and Theseus. Yes, I can see why they would think you two belonged to Geth, I mean, why you would like his music. It's almost as fortuitous as an Aria falling in love with a man named Maestro. Aria didn't laugh. Instead, she reached over and took Seth's hand. When he glanced at her, she smiled softly. Yeah, she whispered and squeezed his hand. Blake, of course, had to interrupt their moment. You really like Kurt Theseus? He's my favorite singer, Aria said with a grin. I didn't think he ever did live shows, I thought he was just an internet phenomenon. I watch all the videos he posts on his channel, I like the way he angles the camera so we can only see his jaw. Seth could hear his mom smile when she agreed. He's my favorite too. He only does local shows. He's local? Aria gave a little wiggle of excitement. Have you seen him live before? Since she directed the question to Seth, he managed to clear his throat and, on the second try, say a few times. Oh, this is so cool. So, do you listen to a lot of country music, Ms. Maestro? Call me Marcia, dear. And no, I prefer classic rock, but I make an exception for Kurt Theseus. He's amazing, Aria said with a sigh. She slumped against the headrest, but didn't drop his hand. His voice is just so creamy. I mean. Seth glanced at her in time to see her blush. Mom reached up to pat their joined hands. You have good taste, my dear. Meh, Blake said, determined to tease, apparently. He's all right. Mom snorted and smacked his arm a third time. Ow. Stop that. I've never had a date hit me as much as you. Smiling, the older woman winked at Seth in the rearview mirror. And I've never had a date who was so full of himself. Dad had been a quiet, academic type. You've had more handsome dates, that's for sure, Seth called out, just to irritate his friend. It worked. More handsome than me? Blake snorted, as if disbelieving. Don't listen to him, dear, Mom said to Aria. Blake isn't really as arrogantly self-involved as he sounds. He likes to pretend he is, and of course with that smile, he never has to worry about female company, but he's really quite kind. Why, Marcia? I didn't realize you liked my smile. Aria was giggling. He's a charmer, isn't he? Excuse me. Blake leaned forward. I'm sitting right here. Mom ignored him. He's my Seth's best friend and was the second person I met after I moved here. He's a sweetheart but doesn't want you to know. Before Blake could interrupt again, she hurried on, he worked with Seth on the ranch. Not quite, Blake interrupted, and Seth could hear his smile. Probably the one he'd named the Lady Killer smile. Seth works for Jim at the stables. Your sister, Artie, is married to my boss. I'm Wyatt's assistant at the track. I handle a lot of the day-to-day operations. I didn't even know Caudron Valley had a racetrack until Artie told me, Aria said. The next 10 miles were taken up with Blake enthusiastically explaining his job and the role of the racetrack on the ranch. Caudron Valley Ranch's livelihood was based on the racehorses they raised, so it made sense to sponsor the local races. That had grown into an entire track, and the annual rodeo. When Blake began to falter, Mom interrupted. And what do you do, Aria? Seth knew she already knew, because he'd told her, and had only asked to be polite. He listened to Aria explain about her business, and how hard she'd worked to build it up. He couldn't help feeling proud of her success, and when she mentioned how exhausting it was, he turned her hand in his so he could press his thumb against the joint he knew always bothered her. Are you still pushing yourself? He asked, his attention on the road ahead. I have a big order that has to go out Tuesday, she replied, half defensively, as if she knew he would tell her to slow down. Seth exchanged a look with his mom in the rearview mirror. Aria has reached that point in her business where she has to keep pushing herself in order to stay on top. Oh, dear, the older woman said. You're going to hurt yourself that way. I want to help her. Seth swallowed, and pulled his hand from hers. He meant more than just rubbing her aches. More than just learning to knit. I want to make sure she doesn't have to work as hard. Blake cleared his throat. You mean a dual-income household? Seth glanced over at Aria, wondering if she understood what his friend meant. Yeah. That's what I mean. She didn't answer, and he couldn't hold her gaze long. For the first time, he regretted having to drive. But if he'd let Blake drive, there was no way he'd make it through the entire drive to Missoula without giving himself away. And for some reason, it was really important to him that Aria find out the truth in the right way. She thinks Kurt Theseus has a creamy voice. The reminder made him smile. Suddenly, Mom's pointing finger shot out next to his right shoulder. Is that one of yours? There was a white cross, a memorial marker on the side of the highway. The grass was so overgrown it was hard to read what it said, even if Seth hadn't been driving by 2 miles over the speed limit. It was Aria who answered. Clearly not. We'll have to add it to the list for next month. It needs a good scrubbing. Seth exchanged another look with his mother in the rearview mirror. She smiled softly, and he knew she'd only asked the question to see what Aria thought about his monthly weird campaign. The fact that she answered that way told them both that she'd accepted him for who he was, weirdness and all. Mom sat back in her seat and launched into a story about Seth as a boy. He hadn't expected that, but her reminiscences kept them entertained for most of the drive. Soon both Aria and Blake were laughing as Seth was groaning. Mom, do you have to tell everyone about the pool peeing incident? Oh, honey, that's not the worst of it. She leaned forward. My Seth has always been a rule follower, you know. He's a real southern gentleman, Aria interrupted with a giggle. Yes, a gentleman, Mom agreed. So, he learned that there was no peeing allowed in the pool, right? Then we took him to the beach. We had a hard time convincing him that he was allowed to pee in the ocean. He was? Blake asked. You're allowed to pee in the ocean? Of course, Aria replied flippantly. Fish do it all the time. Yes, dear, try to keep up, Mom snapped. Anyhow, he refused to pee in the ocean, but of course, there's no place else to go, and everyone was there trying to convince him it was okay. Even little Hannah was yelling, just do it. She chuckled. I can still remember her little voice. Aria shifted eagerly. So, what did he do? Well, he was a gentleman, even at that young age. He knew he shouldn't pee in the ocean. Mom paused for dramatic effect, so he slogged up onto the beach, pulled down his little trunks, and peed into the ocean. She burst into giggles. His mom was giggling, and fell back against the seat. Aria and Blake joined in, while Seth hid his grin. He hated that story, of course, but loved how happy it made his mother. Such a gentleman. Aria teased, rubbing his arm. Please, your praise is making me blush, he cried. Warmth emanated from where she caressed him. I know. Hey. Blake interrupted. I'm going on a road trip, and I'm bringing an automatic can opener. Mom picked up on the game immediately. I'm going on a road trip, and I'm bringing an automatic can opener and a beluga whale. Really? Seth asked drily, his lips curving into a grin as he smoothly changed lanes. At least the silly game would keep them occupied and away from any more embarrassing stories. Fine. I'm going on a road trip, and I'm taking an automatic can opener, a beluga whale, and a capuchin monkey. It was a long moment before he realized Aria hadn't joined in. He glanced at her, and she was staring back at him. Haven't you ever played this game? He asked. You have to add on something to the list, and remember it. We go in alphabetical order, so the first item starts with an A, the second item starts with B. Of course I played the game. I have a billion siblings, and the drive to River's End Ranch in Idaho is nice and long. But when we play it, we bring normal things like apples, berries, cards, and dominoes. He snorted, already smiling. Sure, if you want to have a boring road trip, I guess. When we play it, we make you remember an interesting list. Interesting, eh? She sounded skeptical. Okay, fine. I'm going on a road trip, and I'm bringing an automatic can opener, a beluga whale, a capuchin monkey. This is ridiculous, by the way. What kind of vehicle could manage to carry? Just play the game, shouted Blake, Mom and Seth all at once. Aria sighed. And a diorama of the Battle of Gettysburg? Awesome. She gets it, Blake chuckled, and launched into the list. The game took them into Missoula and almost to the parking lot of the nightclub. Mom kept having trouble remembering quintessence, and Garfield's favorite sunbeam to sleep in kept tripping everyone up. That had been Aria's addition, and although Seth contested it, Mom ruled it an acceptable road trip accompaniment. On the 19th round, Seth added the word secret to the list, and noticed it took Aria a long time before she took a deep breath and dived in. "I'm going on a road trip," she began quietly, "and I'm bringing." Maybe he shouldn't have used that particular noun. But secrets had been on Seth's mind, and he knew she was thinking of them too. Soon, she'd understand. Hopefully. Chapter 8. Strangest double date ever. Still, it was impossible to deny that Seth's mom was a hoot and super fun to hang out with, and Blake had the ability to make Aria laugh almost as much as Seth himself did. She hadn't expected to drive to Missoula with them today, but it had been fun. And now they were here, and showing their tickets to the bouncer, even though they were 3 hours early. The venue was a nightclub, as well as a bar and restaurant too. They got seats at a high-top table situated on the opposite side of the big open room from the small stage, and Aria was pleased to see that, even once the place got really crowded, they'd still be able to see from this spot. She liked Kurt Theseus, yeah, but she wasn't so into mosh pits. It'd be nice to be able to sit there and enjoy his music. It was still so hard to believe they had tickets to see him live. She hadn't even realized he played gigs. Super excited now, she clutched Seth's hand under the table. He sent her a little smile in return, but it seemed iffy, like maybe he was nervous about something. Was he nervous about seeing the show? Actually, come to think of it, he'd been acting a little quieter since he picked her up. Their last real date had been amazing, and she wasn't sure what would cause him to clam up like this. Well, not clam up, exactly. He just wasn't as quick to smile today. He must have something on his mind. You might say he's acting fishy. Aria resisted the urge to snort and roll her eyes at her own subconscious's stupid joke. Well, if you're going to be pacific about it, these ocean jokes are your own fault. 2 weeks ago, she and Seth had gotten into a pun war. It had been such a good time, each of them trying to outdo one another with stupid puns. She'd nearly peed herself laughing so hard, but not at the puns. No, it was his expressions and the voices he used when he delivered them which had her choking on her own laughter. That had been the moment she'd realized the truth, this is what she wanted from life. And then, last week, he'd told her he loved her. He loved her, and she loved him, and she wanted to continue loving him. She wanted to love him forever. She wanted stupid pun wars, and outrageous road trip games, and cooking together. She wanted hand rubs and listening to him hum as he knitted and singing country songs at the top of their lungs as they drove along with the windows down. She wanted picnics, and geocaching, and his poetry. She wanted his kisses, and his gentle touch, and his caring heart. She wanted to be there for him, to be his confidant, and share her own secrets with him. She wanted forever. But what did he want? Blake tapped on his menu. Okay, listen, I know from experience that you're going to want to go ahead and figure out everything you want to order now, so when the server comes by, we just tell her a big list. This place is about to get really busy. The 4 of them didn't speak much as they leaned over their menus. When the server came by, Marcia ordered a pulled pork sandwich, Blake and Seth got burgers, and Aria opted for a French dip with fries. When they were finished, Marcia passed around the hand sanitizer. Here, use this. I don't know how often this place washes their menus, but do you know menus are the dirtiest parts of a restaurant? Everyone touches them. Blake winked as he rubbed the hand sanitizer between his hands. Not the bathroom door handle? Well, I don't know about that, Seth's mom said with a cute wrinkle of her nose. But I try not to touch it after I've washed my hands, and yes, Blake, I always wash my hands when I go to the bathroom. While the other man hummed thoughtfully, pretending this was news to him, Aria nudged Seth with her shoulder. You okay? What? Seth jerked, then sent her a sheepish smile. Yeah, sorry. I guess I'm just preoccupied. Me too. I'm excited to get to see Kurt Theseus live. I want you to get a picture of me with him in the background, so I can send it to my sisters. His smile turned a little sickly. Okay. If I can't, I'm sure Mom could. Can't? Why wouldn't he be able to? She narrowed her eyes. Where are you planning on being? Instead of answering her, Seth leaned closer. She was just about to open her mouth to repeat the question when he captured her lips with his, and she forgot all about whatever she'd been complaining about. After, both of them breathing heavily, Seth pressed his forehead against her. I love you, Aria Weston. I hope I'm worthy of you. What an absolutely heart-meltingly sweet, incredibly strange thing to say. Why wouldn't you be? She whispered back. He straightened, still holding her, his eyes flicking between hers. You were right. I've been keeping a secret from you. But I love you, and I want a future with you, so tonight. She was holding her breath, her eyes wide. When he trailed off, she raised her brows. Tonight what? Tonight you'll learn everything you need to about me. Her gaze shot sideways, to where his mother was pretending great interest in the ceiling. What? Aria hissed, her eyes going back to his. Now? No, sweetheart. But soon, I promise. What was he talking about? She was going to learn his secret tonight? Wait, he admits to keeping a secret from me? She'd suspected it, but actually hearing it confirmed, well, she wasn't sure what she was supposed to be feeling. Irritation at the secret, obviously, but pleasure he was finally going to come clean, she supposed. But more irritation at him not just coming out and telling her. But pleasure that he'd said he wanted a future with her. This is getting confusing. You two need a room? Want Marcia and me to go take a walk and give you some privacy? At Blake's drawled question, Aria pushed away from Seth, still eyeing him in confusion and concern. She hated not knowing what was going on. And he looked even more nervous than before. She didn't have a chance to worry about it, though, because their dinners showed up then, and the four of them dug in. Actually, Marcia and Blake chowed down, while Aria and Seth pushed their food around their plates. Not that she was watching his plate or anything. Who are you lying to? You haven't been able to keep your eyes off him, girl. Conversation slowed at their table as the place started filling up, and it got harder and harder to hear each other. They were finishing up their meals, still an hour before show time, when Blake tapped on his watch and sent Seth a look. Nodding, Seth pushed back from the table, and leaned down to give his mom a kiss on her cheek. What a gentleman. The kiss he then gave Aria wasn't particularly gentlemanly, but she didn't mind at all. The little groan he gave as he pulled away told her he was enjoying their touches as much as she did. Since he was still leaning over her, Aria had to tilt her head back to meet his eyes. He held her gaze, his expression serious. I love you, Aria Weston. Just keep believing in me, a little longer. Okay? When she mutely nodded, he dropped another kiss on her forehead, then nodded to Blake. The other man waved cheerfully, and the two of them began to move through the crowd toward the entrance. Aria watched them go, her stomach a ball of nervous energy. Where was he going? Was he going to get something? Just keep believing in me. That was a heck of a command to give her when he just admitted he was keeping a secret, huh? But when he paused once at the entrance to turn and smile at her, she knew she would keep believing. Once outside, Seth was able to breathe freely. He didn't think he'd ever been this nervous before a show, even the early ones he'd done in high school. You okay, man? Blake slapped him on his back, then moved around Seth to reach into the bed of the truck. Looking a little green about the gills there. Seth managed a weak smile. That was quite the nautical metaphor for a guy who didn't know you could pee in the ocean. Haha. Blake grunted as he lifted one of the boxes, then jerked his head. Let's get this stuff backstage. I've already gotten 3 texts from the manager. Asking where I was, or asking if you were taking her out on another date. His best friend didn't answer, but did mutter something unflattering as he led the way around the back of the building. Seth was happy to let his friend take charge when they reached the guard, talking their way through to set up. He didn't want anyone to look at him too closely, and realize who he was. Live shows always carried some risk to his careful masquerade, but this one would be worth it. Once backstage, Blake was the one who directed 2 of the young techies on where and how to set up the equipment, while Seth hid himself in the green room to get warmed up. He pulled on the flannel shirt he wore in a lot of his videos. Despite the heat from the lights, there were appearances to maintain, and pulled on his mask. Then he settled the cowboy hat on his head, and picked up the guitar. A calm settled over him, as his heartbeat slowed to a gentle tempo. He could do this. He'd show Aria who he was, and she'd understand. Then he'd show her the ring in his pocket. My Aria. His fingers itched to pick out the song he'd written for her, the song he'd play for her tonight. Soon, sure enough, it felt as if no time had passed at all, before Blake was knocking on the door. Sticking his head in, his best friend nodded at him. You ready, man? Under his mask, Seth smiled. I'm ready. When he stepped out onto the little stage, the nightclub patrons burst into cheers and calls. The bouncers at the front of the stage had their hands full, but Seth just smiled and waved as he made his way to the stool set up for him. He wasn't a flashy performer. He'd agreed to sing for an hour, and he would, but it would be the same kind of performance as his videos, mellow and low-key. Hello, Missoula. They went nuts. He sipped from a bottle of water, giving them time to settle down. Then he pulled his guitar into his lap and smiled as charmingly as he could. Listen, I promise y'all I'm going to play all your favorites. But I want to start with a new song I wrote. Y'all don't mind if I debut it tonight, do you? Judging from the whistles, happy screams, and whoops, they didn't mind. Well, alright then, he said softly. I wrote this for a special person in my life, and I'd like to play it for you. The lights were too bright for him to see anything much, but his gaze was drawn to the back of the room, where he knew his mother and Aria were sitting. He couldn't see them, but he could imagine her expression. He held that image, the memory of her smiling at the barbecue, the first time he'd met her, in his mind as he took a deep breath, strummed a few chords on the guitar, and began to sing. Where the heck was he? For the umpteenth time Aria craned her neck around, looking for Seth among the now excited crowd. He'd disappeared almost an hour ago, and the show was about to start, and for the umpteenth time Marcia reached over and patted her hand. Just relax, honey. My Seth knows what he's doing. What? Aria yelled, trying to hear the woman over the crowd. Seth's mother seemed to understand it was impossible to have a conversation, so she just squeezed Aria's fingers and offered her a comforting smile. It didn't quite work. Oh, she was a dear woman, it was true, and Aria really liked her. But Seth had promised to reveal his secret, and then left. And the show was about to start, and she was going to actually get to see Kurt Theseus live, and she didn't care, because Seth wasn't sitting beside her. Then the lights dimmed, and a masked man came out on stage, and the crowd went wild. Aria squinted toward the stage. Yeah, that was Kurt Theseus all right. She recognized his jawline from his videos, not that she'd watched them on repeat or anything. Her stomach churned, back to being irritated that Seth had wandered off. Hello, Missoula. That was his voice, yeah, but... Aria slowly stood up. That sounded like Kurt Theseus, but it also sounded like... Listen, I promise y'all I'm going to play all your favorites, but I want to start with a new song I wrote. He might have said more after that, but Aria's pulse was pounding too hard in her temples to allow her to hear. Disbelieving, she turned an incredulous look on Marcia, who smiled and nodded and squeezed her hand before releasing her. Marcia knew. Did Blake know? Of course, he'd disappeared with Seth. Seth, who was really Kurt Theseus. Or rather, Kurt Theseus was really Seth. She'd recognize that voice, that creamy, delicious voice, anywhere. And now that she thought of it, she recognized those lips and that jaw and the hair peeking out from under the hat, and the way he held himself, and that smile. Oh my heavens, that smile. Aria slowly lifted her fingertips to her lips, as the entire world seemed to narrow to the space between the two of them. How had she not realized it before? Well, she'd never heard Kurt Theseus speak before, had she? And she'd never heard Seth sing. But she was about to. I wrote this for a special person in my life, and I'd like to play it for you. And then, somehow, amid the crowd and the lights and the sounds, his gaze found hers. And he smiled softly, and she knew, he saw her. Not just saw her, but saw the real her, the her she kept in her heart. Because he kept that version of her in his heart too. There's a song running through my head. There's a feeling running through my heart. It's the kind of tune without an end, but I don't know how to start. Her smiles are my tempo, her loving is my beat. Her laughter is the harmony, playing high and sweet. My Aria. My Aria. She's in my very soul. She's my Aria, her melody makes me whole. Somehow, she managed to keep breathing. He was singing about her. Her joy plays chords against my soul, her teasing makes me sing. The measures of each perfect pitch could mean most anything. It wasn't until she felt the tears running across the backs of her fingers that she realized she was crying, but she didn't bother wiping her eyes. There was no way she was going to block her vision, she didn't even want to blink. She might miss a heartbeat of this magical, incredible moment. And she couldn't do that, because she had every intention of telling her grandchildren about this moment, the moment she realized she was in love with a country music star. Her grandchildren? No, their grandchildren. Because she's my Aria, her melody makes me whole. My Aria. My Aria. She's in my very soul. And then the song was done, and Aria was certain she wasn't the only one in the room crying, but as everyone around them burst into claps and whistles and cheers, Aria just sank slowly down into her seat once more. He'd written her a song. He'd called her his song, and she could tell what it had meant to him. She knew what it meant to her. Breathless, she glanced over at his mother, who had tears in her own eyes. The older woman smiled, then nodded, then opened her arms. Up on stage, Kurt Theseus began to play one of his hits, and around them, the crowd began to stomp and sing along. But Aria threw herself into Marcia's arms, and the older woman chuckled as she hugged and rocked Aria. "Welcome to the family, Aria," she murmured against Aria's hair. My Aria. Aria's heart was full. Chapter 9. Seth played the rest of the set, but he wasn't certain how he made it through. He'd heard other artists talk about the energy of the crowd feeding their own excitement, but he'd never felt that way. To him, his songs were private affairs, and he was used to just sharing them with the camera, and the mic. Singing live always exhausted him. But today, he couldn't even focus on the crowd. No, he was too busy thinking about one member of the crowd, and what she might think of him. He was fairly certain he didn't rush through the rest of the songs, fairly certain he gave the audience what they wanted. Based on the way they cheered, they were happy to see him. But when he announced he was done, they begged for one more song. Well, all right, he drawled with a smile under his mask, his eyes instinctively searching the back of the room. What do you want to hear? The wall of noise which slammed into him made him wince. But he heard more than one voice call out the new song, or your Aria. And he was happy to oblige. It was a nice way to end the evening, all things considered. I'll play my Aria again, he said softly. As he took his time settling himself on the stool, the crowd quieted, and he swore the whole room seemed to be holding its breath as he slowly strummed the first few chords of the song. There's a song running through my head. There's a feeling running through my heart. It's the kind of tune without an end, but I don't know how to start. As he played the last note, the room slowly exhaled, and he joined them. It was a perfect moment, a moment of peace. And it was all his. The crowd erupted in cheers again then, and he stood for a bow with a smile. They might have begged him for more, but he couldn't stand there any longer. He had to get to Aria, had to know what she thought. And if she forgave him for keeping such a secret. Blake was waiting for him in the green room, and helped him pack up his guitar and amps. Then his friend tossed him a new t-shirt. As the material wrapped around his face, Seth heard his best friend say, "Go on, I'll take care of all this." Seth clawed his way into the shirt, already smiling. "Aria's out there waiting for you, man." Blake met his eyes and smiled. "Good luck." Nodding his appreciation, Seth ducked out the door. Time to find her and learn if he'd just screwed up big time, or if he'd gambled and won. Aria was fairly certain she'd cried again when he'd played her song. Yeah, it was her song. He hadn't named her when he'd said he'd written it for someone special, but she knew who he'd meant. He'd named the song after her, for Pete's sake. When he'd stood and bowed, she screamed louder than anyone, clapping wildly until her palms went numb. It had been an incredible experience, seeing Kurt Theseus live. It had been even more incredible, now that she knew who he really was. Secrets. The masked singer's identity had been a secret for a reason. But he'd shared it with her. Aria. Marcia had to practically shout to be heard over the excitement of the crowd. Aria turned to smile at the older woman, and was surprised to see her pointing. Following Marcia's finger, Aria saw him. Seth was standing at the entrance of the nightclub, wearing a t-shirt, his hair adorably mussed. He didn't have a mask on, but now that she knew his secret, she was amazed no one else recognized the shape of his jaw, or the color of those beautifully warm eyes, or the beauty of his smile. When he saw her looking, that smile grew, and he jerked his thumb toward the front door. She nodded, waved distractedly to his mom, and began to elbow her way through the crowd to get to the entrance. Once there, she didn't see him, but managed to slip outside. She took a deep breath and looked around. Where was he? She stepped down into the parking lot, and jogged her way toward his truck, hoping that's where he'd be. When a hand darted out and grabbed her wrist, she almost screamed in surprise. But as she whirled around and opened her mouth, she realized it was Seth, and swallowed whatever noise she'd been about to make so quickly, she almost choked on it. My Aria, he whispered, his eyes searching hers. The sun had set while they'd been inside, but the parking lot was well lit. In the artificial light, she could easily see the fear in his gaze, so she twisted her hand in his hold, until her fingers were twined in his, and smiled softly. That was incredible, Seth. It was as if her admission had been the benediction he'd been waiting for. Slowly, the worry in his eyes faded to relief, and he shifted his weight awkwardly. I was real nervous about. When he trailed off, she tried to help him. About me learning your secret? He winced, dropping his gaze to her shoulder. He shook his head and said softly, I was nervous about sharing my song. Heart. Melt. Nervous about sharing it with your fans? Of course they loved it. I'm sure they thought it was a real honor, to be the first to hear it. His brown eyes flicked up to hers, then away, staring out at the sea of parked cars. No. I was nervous about sharing it with you, he whispered. She placed her palm against his cheek, turning his face back to her. I thought it was the most amazing thing I've ever heard, she confessed quietly. Something akin to joy flashed in his expression, before being swallowed by another emotion. His brown eyes dropped to her chin. Hey. She ran her thumb down his cheek. Talk to me, Seth. A teasing smile found her lips. Or should I call you Kurt? Shoo. He hissed, jerking away from her touch, to twist his head back and forth, as if looking for eavesdroppers. There was no one around, but with a sigh, he tugged on her hand and led her, at a near jog, toward his truck. Seth, what's? She was already breathless. I'm sorry, he called over his shoulder, I'm sorry. They were nearly to the truck when she pulled him to a stop. Whoa, what's going on here? Blowing out a breath, Seth ran his free hand through his hair, the picture of frustration, or worry. He glanced around the parking lot, it was well lit, but they were alone this far from the club, and then sighed slower. His frantic pace seemed to ease as his shoulders slumped. This time, when he gently tugged her hand and cocked his head toward the truck, she gave in, still confused by his reaction. He settled his hands around her waist, which felt nice. But then he lifted, and she was sitting on his tailgate, like she'd done that first day, after he'd taken her geocaching and she'd seen a side of him she hadn't expected. Their first date. Their first kiss. My Aria, he breathed, tilting his head back to be able to meet her eyes. She pulled him closer, wrapping her arms around his shoulders, and bracketing his hips with her thighs. Under her butt, the truck bed was cold, but now that he and Blake had unloaded all the boxes of equipment which had been back here, there was plenty more room. Silently, he pressed his cheek against her chest, and she ran her fingers through the hair at the back of his head. When her fingernails dug into his scalp, he made a little noise of pleasure, and she did it again. Against her, she felt his tension ease, and finally, he began to speak. I've always been musical, Aria. My mom used to joke it was what came from marrying a man named Maestro, but truthfully, Dad was an academic. Mom was the musical one in the family. She said I was the only kid on the block who didn't have to be forced to do his piano practice. Hannah would be outside playing soccer until dark, and there was me, indoors, messing around on whatever instrument Mom had brought home from the band room. Aria hummed and kept up the rhythm on the back of his head, moving her strokes down to his neck and rubbing there. He sighed against her. I didn't set out to become a country music sensation. Blake's theory is that the reason I made it so big was because of the mystery. But the truth is, I didn't want anyone to know it was me. I don't love performing live, so I was content to just post my songs online. After that competition last year, though. The Masked Singer one? It felt, I dunno. Okay, I guess, to be up there in a mask. So, I started to use that shtick. When he didn't say anything else, she prompted him. Seth, why don't you want anyone to know? Slowly, he straightened. Her hand fell to his shoulder, but he didn't seem to notice. He held her gaze. I love making music, Aria, but this, his breath escaped in a half-laugh, half-exasperated sigh, as he shook his head and squeezed his eyes closed. Inside, those people were chanting my name, not my name, Kurt Theseus's name. They were screaming for him and cheering and everything. She hummed in agreement. When his eyes opened, she was surprised by the intensity in them. That's not me. He shrugged. I'm a simple man, Aria. I'm good with horses. I like my place on Caudron Valley Ranch. I like my little house, and my friends, and weekly poker nights. I like my life. And you think, if the truth got out, about you being Kurt Theseus, you'd lose all that? I know I would. Aria, I've made a lot of money doing what I do, but if everyone found out who I really was, they'd be after me to make more. To do more shows, to sign with labels. Even if I stayed on the ranch, working like I do now, he shook his head. It wouldn't be the same. Everyone would look at me differently. I know it. She hadn't thought of it that way. Thoughtfully, one of her fingers traced the outside whirl of his ear as she considered his words. That's why you've been so careful about wearing a mask each time you perform. And why Kurt Theseus's face never appears in your videos online. It's kinda my thing. I'm just waiting for the day someone recognizes my jaw or smile or something. Briefly, her own smile flashed. I've never seen Kurt perform live, but today, as soon as you stepped up on that stage, I recognized how familiar you were. But it wasn't until you spoke that I put two and two together. His chuckle was a bit dry. That's why I'm careful not to speak on camera. You really have been cautious, haven't you? His expression contorted into a wince as he dragged his palms up her sides, then back down again. The movement, the feel of his hands on her, made her shiver in the most delightful way. I've had to be, Aria. His normally creamy voice had gone all hoarse. One little misstep, and my entire life could be screwed up. I hope you understand. I didn't want to lose what I'd built for myself, and I didn't want my mom's life to get messed up, and I didn't want. When he sighed, she tugged on his earlobe. What? I didn't want you to look at me differently. She held his gaze for a long moment, then dropped her chin in a nod. I understand. What do you understand? His whispered, hope warring with worry in his gaze. Slowly, she smiled. I understand why you kept it a secret. And I am so grateful that you've chosen to tell me now. The hope one. She saw the fear slowly leach from his expression as it was replaced by joy and excitement. Really, Aria? Do you forgive me for keeping it a secret? Smiling, she dropped her hands to his chest. I do. I love you, Seth Maestro. I like Kurt Theseus's music, especially that new number of his, but I love you. I know I have trust issues, and I admit I was squicky about falling in love with you while you were keeping a secret. His brow rose. Squicky? You know. Like, icky and squiggly, put together. Squicky. He tried out the word. Okay, I guess that works. He shrugged, one corner of his lips tugging upward. So, you knew I was keeping a secret? She shot him a sardonic look. You're honest as the day is long, Seth. A blind donkey could tell you were keeping a secret. His wry grin grew. Damn, I was hoping my gentlemanly southern charm hid that fact. Oh, it helped distract me, I admit, she teased back. But I could tell there was something else you were hiding, and it made me. She realized what she was about to say and bit her lip to stop herself. Hey. Oh gosh, he really did have the most delicious voice ever, didn't he? Even that one syllable, infused with sexy concern, could make her insides go all gooey. Or maybe that was the way he'd lifted one palm to cup the side of her neck, and his thumb was caressing her jaw. Tell me, Aria. So, she met his eyes, and confessed her secret. I've been thinking a lot about a future with you, Seth. I love you, and I'd like to be with you. But the thought of you keeping a secret from me made me hesitant. He seemed to be holding his breath. And now? And now, she smiled. Assuming I know all your secrets, I think you're an amazingly wonderful man, and I love you, and want to be with you. Leaning toward him, her gaze on his lips, she prepared to seal her declaration with a kiss, but he surprised her by dropping his hands to her waist once more and pulling her forward, off the tailgate. She didn't have time to do anything more than squeal with surprise before her feet were planted on the asphalt. Wah! And then, before she could fully register what was happening, he slid one foot out behind him and dropped down to one knee. What's wrong? Did you lose something? She dropped to her own knee beside him, her gaze sweeping the ground around them as she reached into her pocket for her phone. Here, we can use my flashlight app. She made a startled little eep when he grabbed her hand and the phone. That's when she looked up and met his eyes and realized what was happening. I didn't lose anything, Aria, he said in that gorgeous voice of his. I found something very important. Oh. Still holding on to her hand, which was holding the phone with the flashlight app shining at the parking lot asphalt between them, Seth reached into his pocket and pulled out a ring box. He had to drop her hand, she fumbled to put the phone down, to open the box. But when he did, she sucked in a gasp and her gaze slid to his. I love you, Aria Weston. Just as importantly, I trust you. Will you marry me? I trust you. It wasn't until he'd explained what he stood to lose that Aria understood exactly how much he trusted her. And she trusted him. Her lips curved into a smile. I never imagined this was how my marriage proposal would go. What do you mean? He was looking a little nervous. I didn't think I'd be dense enough to be kneeling down in a parking lot too. Well, he shrugged. I didn't expect to be proposing in a parking lot either, but I bought this ring last week, and I've been waiting for the perfect moment. His lips curled wryly. And, okay, after dark in a nightclub parking lot might not be the best choice, but I felt like the moment was right and we both understood what we were getting and Lord help me, but my knee is going numb and my heart is still pounding and now I'm rambling, so if you could see your way to getting around to giving me an answer. She burst into laughter and threw herself forward, her arms going around his neck and nearly knocking him off balance. Yes, she called in between laughter. Yes, Seth Maestro, I'd be thrilled to become your wife. They were both kneeling on hard asphalt, next to his truck, in the light of a dozen street lamps. But as he wrapped his arms around her, she knew the moment was perfect. I love you, Seth. And I love everything about you, my Aria. Chapter 10. The next few weeks were some of the longest of Aria's life. A big part of her wanted to just run down to the courthouse like her sister Artie had done with Wyatt, but their mother had been disappointed she didn't get to plan a big wedding. And when Aria found out Marcia wanted a chance to celebrate her son's big day, she kept her opinion to herself. So, Mom and Marcia Maestro spent a whirlwind few weeks planning, and then it was the big day. They were married at Seth's church, because they'd decided to stay in Seth's house on the ranch. It had more than enough space, after all, now that she knew what that third bedroom held. So, she cancelled her lease early and started attending church in Caudron Valley, and could not get over how adorably ridiculous Pastor Dinkelheimler was. Why, the poor man had gotten to the point where he was licking his fingers to ward off bad luck whenever the word cauldron was mentioned, and he lived in Caudron Valley. Mom had wanted Aria to wear a fancy white dress, but she thought it was silly to own a gown she'd only wear for one day, so Lainey helped her find a pretty sundress, and Aria knitted a delicate poncho of shimmering silver, complete with crystals tied in, to wear instead of a veil. She knew Seth liked to see her hair in braids, and when she walked down the aisle on her father's arm and saw her love's rapt expression, she knew she'd made the right decision. The ceremony flew past, and then Pastor Dinkelheimler was declaring them man and wife. On one side of her, Lainey and Artie were both nudging her into Seth's arms, while Jim Cauldron and Blake chuckled on the other side of Seth, and then Seth's lips were on hers, and she forgot all the frustrations of the last weeks. At the reception, she danced with her brother Jax and watched Seth being teased by his coworkers, who kept toasting him and offering him bad advice. While the Cauldrons danced with their wives, and Old Man Cauldron danced with Griselda, his housekeeper, Aaron McGovern, and Rusty kept elbowing Seth. Blake wasn't at his side, though. He was across the hall, trying to charm one of Aria's sisters into dancing with him. All of them smiled at him, except Lainey, and Athena seemed oblivious as usual, except that there was a particular cowboy she seemed very interested in. If Aria weren't as focused on her own joy and excitement, she might have wondered at both of those facts. But then the reception was over, and Seth was lifting her into his truck, with plenty of kisses along the way, and they were heading home. Someone had tied cans to the tailgate and written, "Just married. Honk for babies," across the back window, which had seemed funny and cute at the time, but now made Aria blush. Home. They reached her new home in what seemed like record time, but maybe it was the anticipation and the way he kept kissing her fingertips which made it seem that way. He carried her over the threshold and helped her untangle the delicate poncho from around her shoulders, and then he kissed her until her toes curled. And tonight, they didn't have to stop. Tonight, they didn't have to pull away. She was the one who took his hand and led him toward the back hallway. He kicked off his cowboy boots, she loved that he'd been married in them, and eagerly followed, but before they reached the master bedroom, she stopped in front of the door to the third bedroom. The door which had always been shut. Pushing it open, she saw the lights and the fancy computer set up, and the guitar stands. This was his studio, where he recorded all of his videos, the ones which had made him famous. So, she murmured, a smirk on her lips as she cut her eyes toward him. "This is where the magic happens, huh?" With a goofy grin, he tugged her toward the master bedroom. "No, this is where the magic happens." When her laugh turned into a groan and an eye roll, he chuckled too. "Too cheesy?" "A little bit." With a smile, she stepped into his arms, loving the way his hands settled on her hips as she pressed against his chest. "But I liked it," he hummed. "I like you." With a content little sigh, she snuggled closer to him. Pressed against him like this, she could feel exactly how much he liked her. How much he wanted her. And the knowledge, the sensation, sent a bolt of pure longing through her. Seth cleared his throat. "Sweetheart," he drawled in that sexy southern charm of his. "I gotta be upfront with you." "Good." "I don't like secrets," she quipped. "Oh, he shifted slightly. "In that case, I suppose I should tell you I'm one of those weirdos who brushes his tongue. I hope that's not a deal-breaker?" She pretended to consider it as she hid her smile against his chest. "It's not, but I also don't need you to confess everything right now. I'd like to discover my husband's halitosis and severe toenail fungus on my own." When he pinched her butt, she jumped and giggled. "I don't have halitosis." "But toenail fungus?" He pinched her again, but immediately rubbed the sting out. The rubbing felt nice, actually. Really nice. He cleared his throat. Actually, what I was going to confess. More secrets. Was that I've wanted you since the moment I first laid eyes on you. That wasn't much of a confession if she felt the same way. And if she could feel how much he wanted her. Why, Mr. Maestro? She pretended to be shocked. Are you talking about the sex? He grinned that sexy little grin of his. I most certainly am. When she flexed her pelvis forward, pressing against him, he sucked in a breath. Good, she murmured, because I haven't been able to stop thinking about it either. They didn't so much help one another undress as tear off their clothes, something they laughed about later. When they fell into bed, his mouth was everywhere, and his touch made her sing. The way his calluses felt against her bare skin made her shudder with need, and his lips and tongue teased her into near oblivion. And when he entered her, Aria felt her world shatter, then build back up again, then shatter again. In the most wonderful, perfect way. He joined her in ecstasy, calling out her name in a note which made her insides clench again. After, they laid there, panting and exhausted, wrapped around one another. And smiling. His arms tightened around her. I love you, my Aria. She placed a kiss against his chest. And I love you, husband. There'd been the moment his mother had first placed a guitar in his hands. Or the first time he'd written a song. Or the first paycheck the video hosting site had sent him. Smiling, Seth strummed the strings of the acoustic in his lap. Nah. None of those moments compared to the pleasure he'd just found in his wife's arms. Aria was smiling when she floated in from the kitchen, finishing up one of Griselda's cupcakes, and slid in next to him on the couch. He was wearing only his boxers, and when he scooted over for her, couldn't help but admire the way that sexy silk robe parted in the front. Easy there, cowboy. Any more thoughts like those, and you'll be mauling your wife. Again. The thought brought a lazy smile to his lips, and she cuddled up against him. You know, the last time we were here, you wouldn't sing for me. Remember? Her fingers made little circles on his bare chest. It was because you didn't trust me yet. He tried to object. No, that's... Yes it is, Seth. You didn't trust me yet, and that's okay. I understand now. The secret you were keeping, it could have destroyed you. He was stunned by how easily she understood him. How easily she explained him. How easily she forgave him. Seth, you couldn't have told just anyone. Guilt made him wince. You're not just anyone, Aria. No, I'm your wife, now. Wife. His hand tightened around the neck of the guitar. Thanks for marrying me. She smiled. Thanks for asking. Unconsciously, his fingers found the positions for the first chord of my aria. And she joined him in singing. Her joy plays chords against my soul, her teasing makes me sing. The measures of each perfect pitch could mean most anything. The song had been an instant hit. Someone had recorded during the show where he debuted it, and uploaded it. The poor quality of that video had ensured the professional version, when he'd posted it, had shot up the charts. But his favorite version was, and always would be, the times he sung it with her. Thank you for trusting me with your secret, Seth, she whispered, pressing her cheek against his bare shoulder. That was incredibly humbling. There wasn't much he could say to that, so he brought up something he'd been thinking about. I don't think I want to do any more live shows. I didn't do a lot to begin with, but Blake agrees, and assuming you're okay with it. I think it's a good idea. Each time you perform live, there's another chance your real identity might come out. Exactly. It's getting harder to sneak in and out, someone's going to recognize me. He took a calming breath and shifted so he was facing her. Are you okay helping me produce more videos? I figure if I up my output, I can nix in-person events completely. And I can do the videos here at home, especially with your help. Her eyes had taken on a faraway sort of cast. Home, she whispered with a soft smile, which made him reach over and take her hand. She glanced around the little house. Yes, I think I could do that. Especially since I've started slacking off on my business, so I have more time. He hurried to point out, don't feel like you have to help, sweetheart. The ranch pays me enough to take care of both of us. Her grin grew. How about both of us and a baby? Her words caused a jolt through his stomach, and instinctively his gaze dropped to her waist. She couldn't be pregnant already, could she? You want a baby? He asked in a strangled voice. She shrugged. I'm not in any hurry, but maybe in a year or so. He was surprised by the sense of relief which made his muscles go soft. He wanted kids, he really did, but the idea of having them now was a lot of change in a short amount of time. So, he cleared his throat. We could start with a kitten, how about that? I've heard they like yarn, she giggled. He joined her in laughing. Deal, he said in relief. Suddenly, she dropped his hand and jumped up from the couch. I made you something, don't laugh, okay? As she flounced out of the room, Seth grinned. Watching her in that sexy silk robe, the way she moved, he didn't much care what she was going to get, because the vision of her all wrapped up like that was a gift in itself. He swung his guitar off his lap and settled it beside him, then propped his feet up on the coffee table. She came back holding a little bundle of wool. It wasn't wrapped, and when he took it from her, he ended up holding 2 socks, each done in a simple white and gray pattern. You made me socks? He asked, incredulously. She was blushing. I know I said I'd make you Bigfoot slippers, but I was just feeling these. It's kinda stupid. No lunging for her, he grabbed her hands and pulled her down on his lap. I love them. I love you. I can't believe, he shook his head and wrapped his arms around her, socks and all. With the way your hands have been hurting, you actually knitted me something? She was smiling shyly, her attention on his chest where her palm rested. Our moms did most of the planning, and I needed something to keep me occupied. But, your hands? She shrugged and peeked up at him. They've been feeling better, since you made that appointment at the chiropractor for me. And, since being with you. When she took a deep breath, he felt it against his chest as well, and gave her a gentle squeeze. Her fingers caressed his skin and she smiled softly. It's hard to explain, she whispered. Since being with you, I feel. Well, I wanted to knit these. For the last year or so, I've been burned out, and knitting is a chore. She met his eyes. But lately, I have my joy back, Seth. I wanted to make these for you. I realized it was maybe because I've just been making orders for strangers. But you're someone I love, I could imagine you wearing these, as I made them. It was a humbling gift. I'll wear them every day, Seth promised fervently. But she wrinkled her nose. Every day? That might get stinky. Chuckling, he agreed. How about every other day? With a little giggle, she pressed her cheek against his shoulder. Deal. For a long moment, he just held her, content to feel her heartbeat against his skin and breathe in and out in tempo with her. You know, he finally murmured, you could cut back on internet orders and just focus on inventory to sell at local events. As long as something crazy like a quarantine doesn't shut them all down, he teased. She chuckled softly, contentedly. I like that idea. The way her fingers were making little circles on his chest had him thinking about other things. Things that didn't have much to do with work, but everything to do with the woman in his arms. His wife. He shifted, wondering if she could feel the evidence of his arousal under her cute rear end. Maybe she did, because suddenly she turned and pressed a kiss against his bare shoulder. So, if you cut back, and I cut back, we would have more time for each other, right? He hummed and shifted his hold on her. I plan on having plenty of time to spend with you. The way her breath hitched told him she understood and agreed. And his blood was pumping in harmony with her. She swung one leg over his, so she was almost straddling him, and the position made him groan with need. Oh yeah, she asked in a teasing tone. Why is that? Leaning forward, he dropped a kiss on her neck, right where it met the shoulder, and she tilted her head to one side to give him better access. Because I have plans, he murmured against her skin. The sound she made was like a purr as she arched against his touch. Like what? She whispered breathlessly. He straightened, and in one movement, stood and swept her into his arms. He wanted her as much as she wanted him, and now, thanks to the trust they'd shown one another, they had a lifetime to explore one another's bodies, hearts, and souls. Mrs. Maestro, let's go make beautiful music together. Epilogue. Aaron wanted to chase Griselda off with a stick, but he knew he'd have way too many cauldrons to answer to if he did that. Why she'd felt the need to force a cupcake down his throat was absolutely beyond him. As he was wiping red frosting from his forehead where she'd first shoved it at him, his eyes met a woman's across the crowded barbecue. He didn't know who she was, and he was sure she wouldn't be interested in him anyway. Aaron sighed dramatically, feeling like a duck out of water. He didn't like being surrounded by people. He enjoyed working with the animals on the ranch, but the people? He could take or leave them. He wanted to walk over and introduce himself to the girl as he could see his coworker Seth was doing with a different girl, but he just didn't have the courage. Aaron was shy, and though he'd been teased for it his entire life, he wasn't ashamed of it. It was a part of who he was. He was a cowboy. He was shy. And he wrote Western romance under a woman's name. No, it wasn't a normal thing to do, but he'd had a love of romance since he'd first read Cyrano de Bergerac in high school, and the idea of having a love like Cyrano had for Roxanne, well, it made him feel things, right in his gut. He knew his readers would hate it if they found out he was really a man, so he hid that little piece of him from everyone. The guys at the ranch would make fun of him for it. The women would stop reading his books. No, he was just going to live out his life as a hermit, imagining real love. He looked back across the crowded area, spotting her one more time. She looked like an angel to him with her silky blonde hair. He'd have to put himself into a book as a hero and her in as his heroine. It was the only way he could exercise the feelings that were growing inside him. Because there was no way he could bear himself enough to get to know a woman who looked like her. Just like in one of his novels, he'd fallen in love at first sight. And there was no way he could ever tell her.